Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What is the exact moment the divine masculine starts awakening? Is it when he finally reaches out? Is it when he admits the connection? Is it when he says the words you have been waiting to hear? Maybe. But what if the awakening begins long before he speaks? What if the first sign is not a message, not a confession, not a dramatic return, but a quiet moment inside him where the old story suddenly stops working? A moment where distraction no longer feels like freedom. A moment where silence no longer feels like peace. A moment where the distance he created no longer protects him from the truth. A moment where he realizes, I am not numb. I am avoiding. That is where the awakening begins. Not when he becomes perfect. Not when he becomes instantly available. Not when all his fear disappears. But when he can no longer believe the lie that he feels nothing. Because the divine masculine may spend a long time hiding behind control. He may use logic, busyness, silence, pride, other people, emotional distance, or the old masculine mask to keep himself from feeling what the connection has awakened. He may tell himself he is fine. He may convince himself he has moved on. He may act like nothing touched him deeply. But then something happens. A memory returns. A dream shakes him. A song opens his chest. A quiet night makes the truth louder than his defenses. And suddenly he cannot keep running from himself. He starts seeing the pattern. He starts feeling the cost of the mask. He starts realizing that what he called strength may have been fear. He starts understanding that what he pushed away may have been the very thing his soul was trying to show him. That is the exact moment awakening begins. The moment he stops asking, how do I escape this feeling? And starts asking, what is this feeling trying to teach me? So if you have ever wondered when the divine masculine truly begins to awaken, stay with me. Because it may not look like what you expected. It may look like silence becoming heavy. It may look like distance becoming painful. It may look like regret becoming honest. It may look like the first crack in the old identity he used to hide behind. And once that crack appears, the soul begins to rise. Chapter 1. The moment the old story stops working. The divine masculine does not always start awakening when he finally speaks. Sometimes he starts awakening when he can no longer believe his own silence. That is where this journey begins. Because for a long time, he may have carried a story inside him. A story that helped him stay protected. A story that helped him explain away the feelings he was not ready to face. A story that made his distance feel reasonable, his silence feel controlled, and his numbness feel like peace. He may have told himself, I am fine. He may have told himself, it was not that deep. He may have told himself, I do not need to think about this. He may have told himself, if it were real, I would know what to do. He may have told himself, distance is better. Distance is safer. Distance means I am in control. And for a while, that story may have worked. It gave him somewhere to hide. It gave him a way to avoid the emotional weight of what the connection awakened. It gave him a reason not to speak. It gave him permission not to feel too deeply. It helped him keep moving through life without having to stop and ask the questions his soul was quietly placing in front of him. But awakening begins when the story stops working. Not when someone forces him to change. Not when he suddenly becomes fearless. Not when every wound is healed. Not when he has the perfect words. Awakening begins in the moment he hears the old story inside himself, and something in him no longer believes it. He says, I do not care. But the words feel hollow. He says, I have moved on. But the memory still has weight. He says, it was nothing. But his body remembers the truth. He says, I am better off numb. But the numbness no longer feels like freedom. That is the first crack. And it may be quiet. No one else may see it. You may not receive a message. You may not hear a confession. You may not notice any dramatic change on the outside. He may still look controlled. He may still be silent. He may still act like the old version of himself is intact. But inside, something has shifted. The lie has begun to lose power. And once a lie begins to lose power, the soul has room to speak. This is why the first stage of awakening is often invisible. The divine masculine may not yet know how to explain what is happening. He may not even call it awakening. He may simply feel unsettled, restless, less convinced by the explanations that used to calm him. The old answers no longer satisfy him. Work does not silence everything. Distraction does not erase everything. Distance does not protect everything. Logic does not explain everything. Something deeper keeps returning. And that return begins to disturb the old story. Maybe he is driving alone and suddenly remembers a moment he thought he had buried. Maybe he hears a song and feels his chest tighten. Maybe he sees something ordinary that brings back the emotional atmosphere of the connection. Maybe he wakes from a dream and carries the feeling through the entire day. And he tries to say, "It means nothing." But this time, the sentence does not land. Because something in him knows. It knows the connection affected him. It knows the silence was not empty. It knows the distance did not erase the truth. It knows he has been surviving through avoidance, not resting in peace. That knowing is the beginning. Not the full awakening, but the beginning. Because the exact moment the divine masculine starts awakening is the moment he becomes honest enough, even privately, to feel the gap between the story he tells and the truth he carries. That gap becomes impossible to ignore. The story says, "You are unaffected." The truth says, "Then why does this still move through you?" The story says, "You are in control." The truth says, "Then why do you feel restless in the silence?" The story says, "You do not need to face this." The truth says, "Then why does it keep returning?" These questions do not come to punish him. They come to wake him. Because awakening rarely begins with certainty. It often begins with discomfort. The discomfort of realizing that the life he built around not feeling is no longer enough. The discomfort of recognizing that his emotional distance may not be wisdom. It may be fear. The discomfort of seeing that his old identity, the controlled one, the unreachable one, the man who always knows how to stay composed, may have been protecting him from the very truth that could heal him. That is difficult to face. Because the old story was not random. It served a purpose. Maybe he needed that story to survive emotional overwhelm. Maybe he needed to believe he was fine, because admitting he was not fine would have opened too much pain. Maybe he needed to call the connection nothing, because calling it meaningful would have required vulnerability. Maybe he needed to call distance peace, because admitting it was avoidance would have made him responsible for what he was running from. So the old story protected him. But protection can become prison. And when the divine masculine begins to awaken, he starts feeling the prison. The walls that once made him feel safe now make him feel alone. The silence that once gave him control now makes his inner world louder. The emotional numbness that once helped him function now begins to feel like separation from himself. This is when he begins to question what he used to defend. Was I really calm? Or was I disconnected? Was I really over it? Or was I numb? Was I really protecting my peace? Or was I avoiding my heart? Was I really strong? Or was I afraid to be seen? These questions are sacred because they mark the first movement from unconsciousness to awareness. Before this moment, he reacts. After this moment, he begins to observe himself. That is a powerful shift. He may notice how quickly he dismisses emotion. He may notice how often he reaches for distraction when memory appears. He may notice how he becomes cold when tenderness rises. He may notice how he tells himself he does not care right after something touches him deeply. For the first time, he may begin seeing the pattern instead of only living inside it. And when he sees the pattern, even briefly, the old story begins to weaken. Because unconscious avoidance can continue for years. But conscious avoidance becomes harder to justify. Once he knows he is avoiding, the avoidance feels different. It no longer feels like freedom. It feels like hiding. And that realization can shake him. Because the divine masculine may have believed that his control made him powerful. But now he begins to sense that his control may have been organized around fear. He may have believed that his silence made him strong. But now he begins to feel how silence has also kept him from being understood. He may have believed that emotional distance protected him. But now he begins to feel how distance has also kept him from being loved in truth. This is the beginning of the mask cracking. Not falling completely. Just cracking. And through that crack, the soul begins to breathe. The soul does not accuse him. It reveals. It says, look at what you feel. It says, look at what you keep avoiding. It says, look at how tired you are from pretending not to be touched. It says, look at how the old story keeps you safe but not free. That distinction matters. Safe is not always free. Numb is not always healed. Silent is not always peaceful. Distant is not always detached. And when he begins to understand that, awakening has already started. He may still resist it. He may still argue with himself. He may still try to return to the old narrative because the old narrative is familiar. It may say, do not go deeper. You are making this too complicated. Keep moving. Stay busy. Do not open that door. But once the deeper truth has spoken, the old narrative cannot fully dominate anymore. It may be loud, but it is no longer unquestioned. That is the difference. The old story may still say, it was nothing. But now another voice rises and asks, then why did it change you? The old story may still say, you are fine. But now another voice asks, then why are you so tired from pretending? The old story may still say, stay away. But now another voice asks, are you choosing peace or are you choosing fear? This inner dialogue is the first sacred sign of awakening. Because a man who is completely asleep does not question the mask. He simply wears it. He does not question the numbness. He calls it strength. He does not question the distance. He calls it control. He does not question the silence. He calls it peace. But the awakening man begins to question. He may not have answers yet. But he has questions. And questions are dangerous to old illusions. They open doors. They soften certainty. They interrupt denial. They make the old self explain itself to the soul. This is why chapter 1 is so important. It shows us that awakening does not begin with him becoming emotionally available overnight. It begins with the first honest fracture in the story he used to survive. The story that he feels nothing. The story that the connection did not matter. The story that silence is peace. The story that distance means he is free. The story that control is the same as strength. When those stories begin to sound untrue inside him, something sacred is happening. He is no longer fully asleep. He is standing at the edge of self-honesty. And self-honesty is the doorway into awakening. Because before he can be honest with you, he must become honest with himself. Before he can say, this mattered, he must admit privately that it did. Before he can say, I was afraid, he must stop calling fear wisdom. Before he can say, I ran, he must stop pretending distance was the only option. Before he can say, I feel, he must stop worshiping numbness as strength. This is the private beginning no one always sees. The moment alone. The moment in silence. The moment where he catches himself repeating the old story and realizes he does not fully believe it anymore. That moment may look small, but spiritually it is enormous. Because the soul does not need a grand performance to begin awakening. It only needs one crack in the false identity. One moment where truth becomes stronger than denial. One breath where he stops running long enough to hear what has been waiting underneath. And what has been waiting? The hidden heart. The part of him that still feels. The part of him that still remembers. The part of him that still longs for truth. The part of him that wants to stop living divided between what he shows and what he carries. That part begins to rise when the old story stops working. But rising does not mean he will know what to do immediately. This is important. Awakening is not the same as readiness. He may begin to awaken and still be afraid. He may begin to see the truth and still resist it. He may begin to feel the cost of silence and still not know how to communicate. He may begin to realize the connection mattered and still need time to understand what that means. So do not confuse the first crack with the final transformation. The first crack is only the beginning, but it is still sacred. Because without the first crack, nothing deeper can enter. Without questioning the old story, he remains trapped inside it. Without seeing that numbness is not peace, he may continue calling avoidance healing. Without noticing that distance does not erase the truth, he may keep running from the very feelings that are trying to wake him. That is why this stage matters. It is the moment denial begins to lose its authority. And from there, the next layers can unfold. Silence will start feeling louder. Patterns will become visible. The connection will become a mirror. The mask will begin to collapse. Grief will open the door to truth. Responsibility will begin calling his name. But all of it begins here. With the old story failing. With one quiet realization. I cannot keep telling myself this means nothing when something in me still responds. That is the exact beginning. Not a message. Not a confession. Not a perfect return. A private rupture in the lie. A moment where the divine masculine realizes the truth has been waiting beneath the very story he used to hide from it. And for you, this chapter carries a message too. Do not measure his awakening only by what you can see. Sometimes the deepest shifts begin in silence, long before they become visible behavior. But also, do not build your life around what may be happening inside him. His inner awakening is sacred, but it must eventually become honest action to create safety in the outer world. You can understand that his old story may be breaking, but you do not have to stand still while he learns how to live without it. You can honor the possibility of his awakening while honoring your own peace. Because your path matters too. Maybe his awakening begins when he can no longer believe the lie. And maybe yours begins when you stop waiting for his truth to become your permission to move forward. Both are sacred. So let this chapter remind you. The divine masculine starts awakening the moment the old story stops working. The moment I am fine no longer feels true. The moment it was nothing no longer explains the memory. The moment distance is peace begins to feel like loneliness. The moment he stops asking how to escape the feeling and starts wondering what the feeling is trying to reveal. That is when the soul begins to rise. That is when the hidden heart begins to breathe. That is when awakening quietly begins. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for chapter 2. Because next we are going deeper into when silence starts feeling too loud. And why the quiet he once used to protect himself may become the very place where the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. When silence starts feeling too loud. There comes a moment when his silence no longer feels peaceful. It starts feeling loud. That is where this chapter begins. Because for a long time, the divine masculine may have used silence as protection. Silence gave him control. Silence gave him distance. Silence gave him a place to hide when emotion became too strong, when vulnerability came too close. When the connection began reaching parts of him he did not know how to explain. He may have believed silence made things easier. If he did not speak, he did not have to reveal. If he did not answer, he did not have to feel responsible. If he did not explain, he did not have to face the truth. If he stayed quiet long enough, maybe the feeling would fade on its own. So he became silent. Not always because he had nothing to say. Sometimes because he had too much to say, and none of it felt safe. That is the hidden contradiction. The divine masculine may look silent from the outside, but silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes silence is full of everything he cannot bring himself to name. The longing, the regret, the fear, the tenderness, the memory, the awareness that something has touched him more deeply than his old self wants to admit. At first, silence may feel like relief. He does not have to answer the emotional question. He does not have to explain the shift in his energy. He does not have to confess why the connection still moves through him. He does not have to say, I pulled away because I felt too exposed. Silence becomes a shield. But shields become heavy when they are carried too long. And eventually, the silence that once protected him begins to press against him. It stops feeling empty. It starts echoing. The words he did not say begin to return. The moments he avoided begin to replay. The memory of your voice, your presence, your softness, your patience, your pain, begins to rise in the very quiet he thought would help him escape. That is when silence becomes loud. Not loud to the world. Loud inside him. He may be sitting alone, trying to feel calm. He may have created space, stopped communication, kept himself distant, convinced himself that silence would restore order. But instead of peace, he starts hearing the truth more clearly. Why did I disappear? Why did I not say what I felt? Why does this silence not feel free? Why does the quiet feel heavier than the conversation would have been? These questions are signs that awakening is beginning. Because when a man is fully asleep in his avoidance, silence feels powerful. He thinks he has won because he does not have to engage. He thinks he has control because he has removed himself from emotional exposure. He thinks the absence of conversation means the absence of truth. But when awakening begins, silence becomes a mirror. It shows him what he avoided. It shows him what he still feels. It shows him what he left unresolved. It shows him that distance may stop the dialogue, but it does not always stop the soul from speaking. That is the sacred discomfort of Chapter 2. The divine masculine begins to realize that silence is not neutral. Silence carries memory. Silence carries consequence. Silence carries the weight of what was not said. And when the heart begins waking up, every unsaid thing can become louder than speech. He may hear the apology he never gave. He may hear the truth he never confessed. He may hear the softness he never allowed. He may hear the question he avoided because answering it would have required courage. Did this matter? Did she reach me? Was I afraid? Did I run from the connection or from myself? These questions can begin to haunt the silence. Not to punish him, to awaken him. Because silence has a way of removing distractions. In conversation, he can defend, explain, redirect, or keep things on the surface. In noise, he can avoid. In busyness, he can postpone. But in silence, there is nowhere to perform. He is alone with himself. And that is often where the truth begins. He may still try to resist it. He may turn on music, check his phone, fill his schedule, stay around people, keep moving. But the deeper silence is not outside him anymore. It is inside him. And once the inner silence becomes full, he cannot escape it simply by making life louder. This is where he begins to feel the cost of not speaking. Because silence may have helped him avoid vulnerability. But it may also have created distance from something real. It may have protected him from immediate exposure, but it may have left another heart confused. It may have given him control, but it may also have kept him from clarity, healing, and honest connection. He may begin to understand that silence was not just something he chose. It was something that shaped the connection. It shaped how safe it felt. It shaped how much trust could grow. It shaped whether tenderness had space to breathe. It shaped whether the truth could be met or only buried. And once he sees that silence is no longer innocent, it becomes revealing. Because now he has to face the difference between needing time and disappearing, between processing and avoiding, between taking space with care and leaving someone in uncertainty because he did not know how to hold his own emotions. That difference matters. Healthy silence can be reflective. Avoidant silence becomes a wall. Healthy silence creates space for truth. Avoidant silence hides from truth. Healthy silence returns with clarity. Avoidant silence leaves confusion behind. And the awakening divine masculine begins to feel this difference inside himself. He may realize that he did not always stay silent because he was calm. Sometimes he stayed silent because he was overwhelmed. He did not always stay silent because there was nothing to say. Sometimes he stayed silent because what needed to be said felt too vulnerable. He did not always stay silent because he was protecting peace. Sometimes he was protecting pride. That realization can humble him, because it shows him that silence was not always strength. Sometimes silence was fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being wrong. Fear of needing. Fear of apologizing. Fear of admitting that the connection affected him. Fear of opening a door he did not know how to walk through. And when fear is finally seen as fear, the old pattern begins to lose power. This is the exact reason silence becomes loud during awakening. Because what he once called peace starts revealing itself as avoidance. What he once called control starts revealing itself as emotional distance. What he once called strength starts revealing itself as fear of vulnerability. And once that truth rises, he cannot unknow it. He may still be silent outwardly, but inwardly, the silence is speaking. It may say, "You did not say enough. You hid behind distance. You left truth unfinished. You called it nothing because it was too real. You made silence carry what your heart was too afraid to speak." That can feel heavy. But heaviness is not always a bad sign. Sometimes heaviness means the heart is waking up to the weight of its own avoidance. Before awakening, silence may feel light because he is disconnected from impact. After awakening begins, silence may feel heavy because empathy is returning, awareness is returning, emotional responsibility is returning. He begins to feel not only his own fear, but also the possible effect of his silence. What did she feel when I disappeared? What confusion did I create? What did my silence communicate, even if I did not intend it? Did I protect myself at the cost of leaving someone else alone with questions? These are mature questions. Painful but mature. Because they move him out of pure self-protection and into relational awareness. He is no longer only asking, "How do I stay safe?" He is beginning to ask, "How did my way of staying safe affect someone else?" That is a sign of awakening. The masculine heart begins to widen. It begins to understand that love is not only about what he feels privately. It is also about how he handles what he feels. It is about whether he can communicate with care, whether he can take space without disappearing, whether he can protect his own nervous system without wounding another person through silence. This is where emotional maturity begins calling him. Because the awakened divine masculine must learn that silence is not always the answer. Sometimes silence is necessary for reflection, but sometimes silence becomes a hiding place. And if he wants to become honest, he must learn the difference. He must learn to say, "I need time," instead of vanishing. He must learn to say, "I am overwhelmed," instead of becoming cold. He must learn to say, "This matters and I am scared," instead of pretending nothing is happening. He must learn to say, "I do not have all the answers, but I do not want to hide behind silence anymore." That kind of communication may feel difficult at first. It may feel exposing. It may feel unfamiliar. But it is how he begins to transform silence from a wall into a bridge. Because silence itself is not the enemy. Unconscious silence is. Silence without care. Silence without return. Silence without honesty. Silence used to avoid responsibility. Silence that leaves another heart bleeding in the unknown. That is the silence that awakening begins to challenge. And this challenge may grow stronger over time. The more his heart wakes up, the harder it becomes to use silence casually. The more he feels the truth, the heavier it becomes not to speak it. The more empathy returns, the more he understands that silence is never only internal. It has a relational impact. This is why he may begin to feel restless in his own quiet. He may want to reach out, then stop himself. He may type a message, then delete it. He may think about explaining, then fear what explanation would open. He may feel the pressure of unsaid words building inside him. This pressure can become intense. Because silence can contain truth only for so long before truth begins pressing against it. And when truth presses long enough, the man has to choose. Will he keep using silence to protect the old self? Or will he begin using words to honor the awakened heart? That choice is part of the awakening. Not because words solve everything immediately, but because honest words begin breaking the pattern. A single honest sentence can be more powerful than weeks of silent longing. A single accountable message can become the first sign that fear is no longer fully in control. A single admission, "I was scared, I was overwhelmed, I did not know how to speak. I know my silence hurt you," can mark the beginning of a new masculine maturity. But he must choose it. No one can choose it for him. And for you, this chapter carries an important reminder. If his silence is becoming loud inside him, you may sense it. You may feel the energy shift. You may feel that the silence is no longer empty, that something unresolved is moving beneath it, that he may be confronting truths he once avoided. But do not make his silent awakening your responsibility. Do not chase the words he has not yet found. Do not live inside the question of whether his silence means he cares. Do not keep abandoning your own peace because you can feel that something may be happening beneath the surface. Because even if his silence is loud inside him, you still deserve clarity in your life. His internal process is sacred, but so is your emotional safety. His awakening may begin in silence, but love cannot live forever there. At some point, truth must become communication. Feeling must become responsibility. Awareness must become action. Otherwise, the silence may be meaningful, but it is still not safe enough to build trust. That is the balance. You can understand the depth behind the silence without romanticizing the silence itself. You can sense that he is awakening without waiting endlessly for him to speak. You can honor the possibility of his growth while still choosing your own grounded peace. Because your awakening may be this. You no longer need to decode silence to feel worthy. You no longer need to chase someone into words. You no longer need to make his inability to speak the center of your emotional world. If he is truly awakening, the loudness of silence will eventually teach him that silence is not enough. Not enough to heal what was wounded. Not enough to honor what was real. Not enough to build the kind of love that can hold truth. And when he understands that, he will begin to see that the silence he used to hide may be the very silence that taught him what he needs to say. That is the sacred truth of Chapter 2. Silence starts feeling too loud when the divine masculine can no longer use it as a comfortable hiding place. The quiet begins to echo with memory, regret, longing, empathy, and everything left unsaid. What once felt like control begins to feel like avoidance. What once felt like peace begins to feel like unfinished truth. And that loud silence becomes part of his awakening. Because in the silence, he finally hears himself. He hears the fear. He hears the longing. He hears the regret. He hears the truth beneath the story. He hears the hidden heart asking to stop being buried. And once he hears it, even if he resists at first, the old silence is never the same. It has become a mirror of what he avoided, a mirror of what still matters, a mirror of the man he has been, and the man he is being called to become. That is where Chapter 2 leaves us. With the understanding that his awakening deepens when silence stops protecting the mask and starts revealing the truth. The quiet becomes too loud because the soul is speaking through everything he refused to say. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 3. Because next we are going deeper into the first time he sees his own pattern. And why true awakening begins not only when he feels something, but when he finally recognizes the ways he has been running from it. Chapter 3. The first time he sees his own pattern. The divine masculine does not truly begin to awaken only because he feels something. He begins to awaken when he sees the pattern. That is where this chapter begins. Because feeling alone is not always enough to change a man. He can feel deeply and still run. He can miss someone and still remain silent. He can feel tenderness and still hide behind control. He can know something matters and still act as if it does not, because the pattern is stronger than the feeling. The pattern is what he has practiced for years. Pull away when things get real. Go quiet when vulnerability rises. Get busy when emotions become too loud. Act indifferent when tenderness feels exposing. Call it confusion when the deeper truth is fear. And for a long time, he may not see it as a pattern at all. He may call it personality. He may call it independence. He may call it needing space. He may call it protecting his peace. He may call it just the way he is. But awakening begins when he stops believing that explanation so easily. It begins when he sees the repetition. Not just one moment. Not just one connection. Not just one silence. Not just one withdrawal. A pattern. A pattern of becoming distant when he feels too much. A pattern of numbing when his heart starts opening. A pattern of hiding when someone sees him too clearly. A pattern of choosing control when love asks for honesty. That is a sacred and uncomfortable moment. Because when a man sees his pattern, he can no longer pretend each reaction is random. He can no longer say, "This just happened," without feeling the deeper truth beneath it. He can no longer blame every situation, every person, every timing issue, every emotional intensity, without noticing the one thing that keeps repeating. Him. His fear. his avoidance, his silence, his way of protecting himself from the very intimacy he secretly longs for. This realization can humble him, because before he sees the pattern, he may believe the problem is always outside of him. The connection was too intense. The timing was not right. The other person wanted too much. The emotions were too complicated. The situation was unclear. The pressure was too high. But when awakening begins, the question changes. Instead of only asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he begins asking, "Why do I keep responding this way?" That question is powerful, because it moves him from defense into awareness. It moves him from blame into self-reflection. It moves him from being a man controlled by old programming into a man who can finally begin to observe his own inner world. And observation is the beginning of freedom, because what he cannot see controls him. But what he can see, he can begin to change. This is why Chapter 3 matters so deeply. The first time he sees his own pattern, he may begin noticing the invisible script that has been running his emotional life. He may see that every time closeness becomes real, something in him panics. Every time tenderness rises, something in him hardens. Every time someone reaches his hidden heart, something in him creates distance before the connection can ask too much of him. He may begin to remember other moments, other relationships, other conversations, other almost openings. Other times he wanted to speak, but did not. Other times he felt something real, and then disappeared behind logic, silence, or control. And suddenly, the current connection is no longer isolated. It becomes a mirror of a larger wound. That is when he starts awakening, because he realizes the pattern is not really about one person alone. It is about his relationship with vulnerability, his relationship with being seen, his relationship with needing, his relationship with emotional responsibility, his relationship with the parts of himself he has been too afraid to bring into the light. This can feel confronting, because seeing the pattern means seeing the cost. He may begin to understand that his silence did not only protect him, it also created confusion. His distance did not only give him space, it also prevented intimacy. His numbness did not only help him function, it also separated him from his own heart. His control did not only keep him safe, it also kept him lonely. And when he sees that, he may feel grief. Grief because the pattern has taken more than he realized. It may have cost him closeness. It may have cost him trust. It may have cost him emotional honesty. It may have cost him chances to be loved in a way he secretly wanted, but did not know how to receive. That grief is part of awakening. Because once he sees the cost, he can no longer romanticize the defense. The wall may have protected him, but it also imprisoned him. The silence may have saved him from exposure, but it also kept him from truth. The distance may have reduced his fear, but it also reduced his capacity to be fully met. That is a painful realization, but it is also liberating, because now he finally understands that the pattern is not his destiny. It is something he learned, and what was learned can be unlearned. Maybe he learned early that emotion was unsafe. Maybe he learned that needing made him vulnerable to disappointment. Maybe he learned that silence avoided conflict. Maybe he learned that if he pulled away first, no one could abandon him. Maybe he learned that staying in control was the only way to avoid being hurt. These lessons may have helped him survive, but they were never meant to become his whole life. And now, the awakened part of him begins to ask, is this still protecting me? Or is it keeping me from the love I say I want? That question can change everything, because the pattern often survives by pretending to be protection. It says, pull away. You will be safer. It says, stay silent. You will keep control. It says, do not reveal too much. You will avoid pain. It says, numb yourself. You will not have to feel the loss. But awakening asks, at what cost? At what cost do you stay safe? At what cost do you stay silent? At what cost do you keep your heart hidden? At what cost do you keep choosing distance when your soul is asking for truth? These questions are not easy. They can shake the old masculine identity. Because if he has built himself around emotional control, seeing the pattern means admitting that control has not made him free. It has only made him difficult to reach. And being difficult to reach may have felt powerful for a long time. But it has also kept the deepest parts of him untouched, unseen, and unloved. That is why he may resist seeing the pattern. He may try to explain it away. He may say, "This is just how I handle things." But the deeper voice asks, "Is it helping?" He may say, "I just need space." But the deeper voice asks, "Why does space become silence?" He may say, "I do not want drama." But the deeper voice asks, "Are you avoiding drama or avoiding honesty?" He may say, "I am protecting my peace." But the deeper voice asks, "Then why does your peace feel so lonely?" This inner questioning can feel like a battle. Because the old self wants to stay defended. The awakened self wants to become honest. And the first time he sees his pattern, he may feel exposed to himself. That is important. Before, he may have feared being exposed to someone else. Now he is being exposed to his own awareness. He is seeing the ways he runs, the ways he shuts down, the ways he chooses distance when connection becomes vulnerable, the ways he protects the mask while abandoning the heart. That kind of self-recognition is not comfortable. But it is necessary. Because no true awakening can happen without self-recognition. He must see what he has been doing. Not to drown in shame. Not to punish himself. Not to collapse into guilt. But to become responsible. There is a difference. Shame says, "I am broken." Responsibility says, "I can see the pattern and I can choose differently." Shame says, "I should hide." Responsibility says, "I need to learn." Shame says, "This is who I am." Responsibility says, "This is what I learned to do, and now I can begin to heal it." That distinction is sacred. Because when the divine masculine first sees his pattern, shame may rise quickly. He may feel embarrassed by how much he avoided. He may feel regret for the times he disappeared. He may feel discomfort seeing that the common thread was not always the other person, but his own fear of emotional closeness. If he falls into shame, he may run again. But if he moves into responsibility, he begins to awaken. That is why awareness must be held with courage. He must be brave enough to say, "I pull away when I feel exposed. I go silent when I do not know how to name my fear. I numb myself when tenderness becomes too real. I call it confusion when I am actually afraid of being seen. I have been protecting myself, but I have also been avoiding growth." These are not easy admissions. But they are powerful. Because every honest sentence weakens the old pattern. Every time he names what he is doing, he stops being completely ruled by it. Every time he sees the moment before he shuts down, he gains a chance to pause. Every time he recognizes the urge to run, he has the possibility of asking, "What am I really afraid of right now?" That pause is the beginning of change. Not perfection. Pause. A moment between trigger and reaction. A moment between fear and silence. A moment between vulnerability and distance. A moment where the awakened self can speak before the old pattern takes over. That pause is sacred. Because it is where choice enters. Before awakening, he may feel overwhelmed and disappear automatically. After awakening begins, he may feel overwhelmed and notice, "This is the place where I usually disappear." That recognition may not stop the reaction immediately, but it creates awareness. And awareness grows. The first time, he may notice the pattern after it happens. The next time, he may notice it while it is happening. Eventually, he may notice it before it takes over. That is how healing begins. Slowly. Honestly. With practice. With humility. With the willingness to stop calling old wounds personality. Because many men live their whole lives inside patterns they never question. They repeat the same emotional exits, the same silence, the same fear of vulnerability, the same inability to stay when love becomes real. And because they never look inward, they keep believing every connection is the problem. But the awakened masculine begins to understand. The connection is not always the wound. Sometimes the connection reveals the wound. That is one of the deepest truths of this chapter. The connection may not be creating his fear. It may be exposing it. Your presence may not be the reason he runs. Your presence may be the mirror showing him that he has always run when something reaches him deeply. The emotional intensity may not be the enemy. It may be the light shining on the places where he still has not learned to remain present. And when he sees that, the connection becomes a teacher. Not because the other person is responsible for teaching him, but because the connection reveals what his soul is ready to face. It reveals where he is guarded, where he is avoidant, where he confuses control with safety, where he feels tenderness and then punishes himself for it, where he wants love but does not know how to receive it without fear. This is why the first time he sees his pattern can feel almost spiritual, because it is not just self-analysis. It is soul recognition. He begins to see the distance between the man he has been performing and the man he is being called to become. The performed man says, "I am just independent." The awakened man asks, "Or am I afraid of being needed?" The performed man says, "I do not talk about feelings." The awakened man asks, "Or did I never learn how to feel safe speaking them?" The performed man says, "I do not get attached." The awakened man asks, "Or do I pull away before attachment can reveal how vulnerable I am?" These questions open the doorway to healing, because now he is not only reacting to life, he is studying his own soul. And if he keeps going, the pattern begins to loosen. He may begin to communicate a little sooner. He may begin to admit overwhelm instead of vanishing. He may begin to recognize that silence is not always protection. He may begin to ask for space without turning it into abandonment. He may begin to feel tenderness without immediately needing to harden. These changes may be subtle at first, but they matter, because awakening is not only a dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes awakening is a man interrupting one old reaction, one honest message instead of silence, one vulnerable sentence instead of control, one moment of staying present instead of disappearing, one breath where he does not let fear make the decision. That is how the awakened masculine is born. Not all at once, but every time he sees the pattern and chooses even slightly more truth. And for you, this chapter has an important message. If he is beginning to see his pattern, that may be meaningful. It may mean the old unconscious cycle is becoming visible to him. It may mean he is starting to understand that his silence, distance, and numbness are not random. It may mean the awakening is deepening. But remember this: seeing the pattern is not the same as healing the pattern. Awareness is the beginning, not the guarantee. A man can see what he does and still choose not to change. He can name the pattern and still repeat it. He can admit he pulls away and still fail to become emotionally responsible. So do not let his awareness alone become the place where you abandon your own needs. Watch for embodiment. Does he communicate differently? Does he take responsibility without making excuses? Does he respect your emotional reality? Does he try to interrupt the old pattern, even imperfectly? Does his awareness become action? That is what matters. Because awakening must eventually move from insight into behavior, from self-recognition into responsibility, from "I know I do this" into "I am learning how to do something different." And while he learns, you must stay rooted in yourself. Do not become the therapist for his pattern. Do not become the emotional container for his avoidance. Do not keep explaining the same wound to a man who is not yet willing to heal it. You can have compassion. But compassion does not mean becoming available for repeated harm. You can recognize that his pattern comes from fear. But you do not have to keep standing in the path of that fear. You can honor his awakening. But you must honor your own heart too. That is the sacred balance. Because if he is seeing his pattern, his work is to become responsible for it. And your work is to stop taking responsibility for a pattern that was never yours to fix. That is where power returns to both souls. He gets the opportunity to grow. You get the opportunity to remain whole. And if the connection is meant to evolve, it will require both. His awareness, your self-respect, his responsibility, your boundaries, his courage to face the pattern, your courage not to lose yourself inside it. That is true spiritual maturity. Not just feeling the connection, but becoming honest about what the connection reveals. Not just recognizing the pattern, but refusing to let the pattern remain the ruler of the relationship. That is the sacred truth of Chapter 3. The divine masculine starts awakening more deeply when he sees his own pattern for the first time. He begins to recognize that his silence, distance, numbness, and retreat are not random acts of independence, but protective responses that have kept him from vulnerability, intimacy, and emotional truth. Seeing the pattern does not heal it instantly, but it creates the first real possibility of change. Because what he can finally see, he can no longer fully deny. And what he can no longer deny, he can begin to transform. That is where Chapter 3 leaves us, with the understanding that awakening is not only the return of feeling, it is the beginning of self-awareness. The moment he stops blaming every situation and starts asking, "Why do I keep running when something real reaches me?" is the moment the old pattern begins to lose its power. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 4. Because next we are going deeper into when he realizes the connection was a mirror, and why what he felt with you may have been showing him the parts of himself he could no longer keep hidden. Chapter 4. When he realizes the connection was a mirror. There comes a moment when the divine masculine realizes the connection was never only about you. It was also about him. That is where this chapter begins. Because in the beginning, he may think the connection is about attraction, chemistry, timing, desire, curiosity, the emotional pull, the way you made him feel, the way your presence entered his life and disturbed something he had managed to keep quiet for a long time. He may think the intensity is happening because of you. Your energy, your softness, your mystery, your warmth, your ability to see beyond the surface, your ability to make him feel something he does not usually allow himself to feel. And yes, your presence may awaken something real. But eventually, if he is truly beginning to awaken, he starts realizing that the connection is not only showing him who you are, it is showing him who he is. That is when the connection becomes a mirror of his fear, a mirror of his longing, a mirror of his tenderness, a mirror of his avoidance, a mirror of the wounds he thought he had outgrown, a mirror of the hidden heart he has been trying to protect. And that realization can shake him deeply, because a mirror does not create what it reveals. It only reflects what was already there. You did not create his fear of vulnerability. You revealed it. You did not create his longing for emotional safety. You awakened it. You did not create his tendency to pull away when things get real. You exposed it. You did not create the hidden tenderness beneath his mask. You gave it a place to rise. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. The divine masculine may begin to understand that the connection has been showing him the parts of himself he could no longer keep hidden. The connection may have felt like it was about moving toward you, understanding you, wanting you, missing you, resisting you. But underneath all of that, something more sacred was happening. He was meeting himself through the connection. And that can be beautiful. But it can also be terrifying. Because once he realizes the connection is a mirror, he can no longer reduce everything to the outer story. He can no longer say, "She is the reason I feel unstable," without asking what instability existed inside him before you arrived. He can no longer say, "The connection is too intense," without asking why intensity awakens fear in him. He can no longer say, "I need distance from her," without asking whether he is actually trying to create distance from his own emotional truth. That shift is powerful, because it turns his attention inward. Instead of asking only, "Why does she affect me?" he begins asking, "What part of me is being affected?" Instead of asking, "Why is this connection so hard to control?" he begins asking, "Why do I need to control what makes me feel?" Instead of asking, "Why do I want to run from this?" he begins asking, "What inside me learned to run from closeness?" These questions are signs of awakening. Because when the divine masculine is asleep, he sees the connection only as something happening outside of him. Something to manage, something to avoid, something to desire, something to understand from a distance. Something that pulls him, confuses him, tempts him, unsettles him. But when he begins to awaken, he realizes the connection is also revealing his inner world. And that inner world may be far more complex than he wanted to admit. He may see how guarded he is. He may see how quickly he shuts down. He may see how much he longs for tenderness. He may see how deeply he fears needing anyone. He may see how much he wants to be seen, and how much he fears being seen at the same time. That is the mirror. It reflects the contradiction. The part of him that wants love, and the part of him that runs from being loved. The part of him that wants truth, and the part of him that hides behind silence. The part of him that wants to be close, and the part of him that treats closeness like danger. This contradiction can no longer stay invisible once the connection becomes a mirror. He may begin to notice that his reaction to you is not random. He may begin to see that your presence activates certain places inside him. Not because you are wrong, not because the connection is false, but because something about the connection reaches beneath the layer he usually lives from. It reaches beneath the mask, beneath the independence, beneath the control, beneath the rational explanations, beneath the old masculine image that says he is fine, untouched, unavailable to emotional impact. And beneath all of that, he may find a heart that is still tender, a heart that still wants to be met, a heart that still carries old fear, a heart that still remembers pain, a heart that still hopes for a love safe enough to stop performing. That discovery can make him feel exposed. Not only to you, to himself. Because sometimes the most frightening thing is not being seen by another person. It is finally seeing yourself. Seeing the way you run. Seeing the way you hide. Seeing the way you call fear logic. Seeing the way you call numbness peace. Seeing the way you call emotional distance strength. Because admitting the truth would mean something in you still needs healing. That is what the connection may begin showing him. And once he sees it, the connection becomes difficult to dismiss. Because now, even if he tries to push you away, the mirror remains inside him. He may stop talking, but the reflection continues. He may create distance, but the pattern has already been revealed. He may try to reduce the connection, but the deeper questions keep returning. Why do I feel exposed? Why do I want to hide after being seen? Why does her presence make my defenses feel so obvious? Why does this connection reveal a version of me I cannot easily control? These questions are not about you alone. They are about the self that appears in the mirror of the connection. And this is where awakening deepens. Because the divine masculine begins to understand that you may have been the catalyst, but the healing is his. The connection may have opened the door, but the room he is entering belongs to his own inner world. The feelings may have been awakened through you, but the responsibility to understand them cannot be placed on you. That is an important realization. Because before awakening, he may unconsciously blame the mirror. If he feels exposed, he may blame you for being too intense. If he feels vulnerable, he may blame the connection for being too complicated. If he feels fear, he may assume the feeling means something is wrong. If he feels longing, he may try to reduce it or turn it into frustration. But the awakened masculine begins to understand. The mirror is not the enemy. The mirror is showing what needs healing. Your presence may show him where he still fears intimacy. Your silence may show him where he still feels attachment. Your tenderness may show him where he still has trouble receiving softness. Your boundaries may show him where he still expects access without responsibility. Your absence may show him where he was more affected than he admitted. All of it becomes information. Sacred information. Not information he can use to control you. Information he must use to understand himself. That is when the connection becomes a teacher. Not because you are responsible for teaching him, but because the connection reveals the curriculum of his soul. It shows him the lessons he can no longer avoid. How to feel without running. How to need without shame. How to speak instead of disappearing. How to be seen without calling exposure danger. How to love without turning vulnerability into a threat. These are not small lessons. They are initiations. And the connection may have brought them to the surface because his soul was ready to face what the old self could not. That does not mean he will embrace the mirror immediately. He may resist it. Many people resist mirrors. Because mirrors do not flatter the mask. They show what is there. And when the divine masculine sees the parts of himself he has avoided, he may feel the urge to look away. He may want to blame the intensity. He may want to say the connection is too much. He may want to stay busy. He may want to pull back into the old identity that feels safer than self-honesty. But once the mirror has shown him the truth, looking away does not make the truth disappear. It only delays the integration. That is why this stage can be so emotionally charged. He may feel drawn to the connection because it reflects something sacred. He may feel afraid of the connection because it reflects something wounded. He may want to come closer because the mirror shows him his heart. He may want to run because the mirror also shows him his fear. He may feel gratitude for being seen. He may feel shame about what has been seen. This is the double-edged nature of the mirror. It reveals both beauty and shadow. It shows his capacity to feel deeply, and his fear of feeling deeply. It shows his longing for intimacy, and his avoidance of intimacy. It shows his tenderness, and his shame around tenderness. It shows his desire for truth, and his habit of hiding from truth. That is why the connection may feel so powerful to him. Not because it is perfect, but because it is revealing, and what it reveals cannot be unseen. This is the sacred turning point. When he realizes the connection was a mirror, he stops asking only, "What does she mean to me?" and begins asking, "What is this showing me about myself?" That question changes the entire journey. Because now the connection is not only an emotional event. It is a spiritual initiation. It invites him into self-awareness. It asks him to stop using the other person as the explanation for everything he feels. It asks him to take responsibility for his reactions, his fears, his silence, his avoidance, and his longing. It asks him to understand that awakening is not about being consumed by the mirror. It is about learning from what the mirror reflects. And that requires courage. Because he may have to admit, "I am more afraid of intimacy than I thought. I pull away when I feel exposed. I want to be seen, but I do not know how to stay open when I am. I have called emotional distance strength because I did not know how to feel safe in closeness. I blamed the intensity of the connection because I was not ready to face the intensity of my own fear." These admissions are not easy, but they are powerful. They take him out of unconscious reaction and into conscious reflection. They turn the connection from something he is trying to control into something he is finally willing to understand. That is a sign of awakening. And yet, for you, there is an important truth here too. If you have been the mirror, that does not mean you must become the healer. That distinction matters. You may have reflected something he needed to see. You may have awakened a part of him. You may have revealed tenderness, fear, longing, or emotional truth. You may have been the catalyst for a deeper awakening. But you are not responsible for what he does with that reflection. A mirror can show the truth, but it cannot force someone to face it. A connection can awaken the heart, but it cannot make someone mature. A soul bond can reveal the wound, but it cannot do the healing for him. That belongs to him. And your own heart must remain sacred in the process. Because it can be tempting to think, if I am the mirror, I must stay until he understands. It can be tempting to keep explaining, keep waiting, keep holding the reflection steady while he looks away and comes back, looks away and comes back, feels and runs, opens and closes. But your life is not meant to become an endless mirror for someone else's avoidance. You are not here only to reflect his hidden heart. You are here to live from your own. That is important. If the connection has shown him himself, let that be sacred. But do not let his awakening become the place where you abandon your own. Do not let the role of being the mirror become a burden that keeps you waiting in pain. Do not confuse being a catalyst with being responsible for his transformation. The mirror is a gift, but the work is his, and your work is yours. Your work may be to recognize that you can love deeply without rescuing. You can understand his fear without excusing endless distance. You can honor the spiritual meaning of the connection without ignoring the practical need for communication, maturity, and respect. Because awakening must become embodied. It is not enough for him to realize the connection is a mirror if he does not become more honest. It is not enough for him to see his fear if he keeps letting fear decide his behavior. It is not enough for him to know he pulls away when exposed if he never learns how to stay present, apologize, communicate, or grow. A mirror begins awakening. But responsibility proves it. That is the deeper truth. The divine masculine may realize the connection was a mirror, but the question becomes, will he honor what the mirror showed him? Will he face the fear? Will he soften the mask? Will he stop blaming the connection for exposing what needed healing? Will he learn how to love with awareness instead of reacting from wounds? That is where the path continues. Because a mirror can be avoided, or it can be used. He can avoid it by saying the connection was too intense, or he can use it by asking why intensity triggered him. He can avoid it by calling you too much, or he can use it by asking why emotional depth feels like pressure. He can avoid it by retreating into silence, or he can use it by asking what silence is protecting him from. He can avoid it by blaming timing, or he can use it by asking whether timing is hiding fear. That choice is his initiation. And if he chooses honestly, the mirror becomes sacred medicine. Not because it is painless, but because it is true. It helps him see where he is asleep. It helps him see where he is guarded. It helps him see where he has confused survival with strength. It helps him see that the connection did not make him weak. It made him visible. And visibility is often the beginning of healing. Because what remains unseen cannot be integrated. What remains hidden cannot be loved consciously. What remains denied continues to control from the shadows. But once he sees it, once he truly sees it, he has a chance to become different. He has a chance to stop running from the part of himself the connection revealed. He has a chance to stop punishing the mirror because he is uncomfortable with the reflection. He has a chance to understand that the hidden heart is not something to hide forever. It is something to bring home. That is the sacred truth of Chapter 4. The divine masculine starts awakening more deeply when he realizes the connection was a mirror. It reflected his tenderness, fear, longing, avoidance, wounds, and the hidden heart beneath the mask. It showed him not only what he felt for you, but what he had been avoiding inside himself. And once he understands that, the journey changes. The connection is no longer only a mystery to decode. It becomes a doorway into self-awareness. A doorway into honesty. A doorway into healing. A doorway into the deeper masculine self that can no longer stay fully asleep. But the mirror is only the beginning. Because once he sees what the connection reflects, the old mask begins to crack even more. The image of being unaffected becomes harder to maintain. The performance of control becomes heavier. The false self begins to lose authority. And that is where we go next. If this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 5. Because next we are going deeper into the collapse of the masculine mask. And why the moment he can no longer pretend to be untouched may become one of the most powerful turning points in his awakening. Chapter 5. The collapse of the masculine mask. There comes a moment when the mask becomes too heavy to keep wearing. That is where this chapter begins. Because for a long time, the divine masculine may have believed the mask was his strength. The mask helped him appear calm. It helped him seem unaffected. It helped him move through life without exposing the storms beneath the surface. It helped him stay composed when something inside him was anything but composed. The mask said, "I am fine. I am in control. I do not need anyone. I am not affected by this. I can keep moving as if nothing has touched me." And maybe for a long time he believed it. Or at least he needed to believe it. Because the mask gave him an identity. It gave him a way to survive emotional uncertainty. It gave him a way to avoid the places inside him that felt too vulnerable, too tender, too unprotected. It made him feel powerful because it kept other people from seeing where he was afraid. But awakening begins to change that. Because once the divine masculine starts seeing the old story, once silence becomes too loud, once he recognizes his pattern, once he realizes the connection has been a mirror, the mask can no longer feel the same. It may still be there, but now he knows it is there. And that awareness is the beginning of its collapse. Because a mask only has full power when the man wearing it believes it is his real face. The moment he realizes, this is not who I am, this is what I used to hide, something sacred begins to break open. Not outwardly all at once. Not always visibly. Not always in a way anyone else can immediately recognize. But inwardly, the performance begins to crack. The image of being unaffected becomes harder to maintain. The silence becomes harder to justify. The emotional distance begins to feel less like strength and more like separation. The control he once trusted begins to feel like a cage. This is the collapse of the masculine mask. And it can feel terrifying. Because if the mask falls, what is left? The tenderness, the fear, the grief, the longing, the regret, the hidden heart, the truth he has been trying not to face. That is why he may cling to the mask even when it is hurting him. Because the mask is familiar. And the familiar can feel safer than freedom. He may know that pretending is exhausting, but he may not know who he is without the pretense. He may know that silence is lonely, but he may not know how to speak from the heart. He may know that emotional distance has cost him connection, but closeness still feels exposing. So he remains caught between two selves. The self who performs control, and the self who wants truth. The self who says, keep the mask on, and the self who whispers, I am tired of hiding. This is where the divine masculine may become deeply restless. Because the mask no longer works the way it used to. Before awakening, he could hide behind it and feel protected. But now, when he tries to wear it, he feels the falseness. He can sense the gap between what he shows and what he feels. He can hear the emptiness in his own old answers. He says, it is nothing. But the heart does not agree. He says, I am good. But the body carries tension. He says, I do not care. But memory keeps returning. He says, this does not affect me. But the silence keeps proving otherwise. This inner contradiction becomes painful. Because every time he chooses the mask after seeing the truth, he feels divided. He may not have felt that division before. Before awareness, the mask felt normal. It felt like life. It felt like the only way to be a man. But after awakening begins, the mask starts feeling like betrayal. A betrayal of the hidden heart. A betrayal of what he knows. A betrayal of the truth that has already begun rising. And this betrayal can become impossible to ignore. That is why the collapse of the mask may not look like weakness. It may look like exhaustion. The exhaustion of pretending. The exhaustion of staying unreadable. The exhaustion of acting unaffected. The exhaustion of holding back words that want to be spoken. The exhaustion of managing an image while the soul is asking for honesty. He may feel tired in a way sleep does not fix. Soul tired. Tired of being the controlled one. Tired of being the distant one. Tired of being the man who can feel deeply in private and still appear cold in public. Tired of needing to prove he is not touched when something inside him clearly is. That soul tiredness is often a sign that the mask is breaking down. Not because he has failed. Because the false self has reached its limit. The false self can only carry him so far. It can help him avoid pain, but it cannot give him peace. It can help him look strong, but it cannot make him whole. It can protect him from rejection, but it also protects him from love. And at some point, the divine masculine begins to feel that cost. He begins to understand that the mask has taken something from him. It has taken intimacy. It has taken emotional truth. It has taken the ability to be met. It has taken the relief of being known without performance. That realization can bring grief. Because the mask was not only something he wore in one connection. It may have been something he wore for years. Around family, around friends, around lovers, around the world, maybe even around himself. He may begin to see how often he has said, I am fine, when he was not. How often he stayed quiet when he needed support. How often he acted strong when he felt alone. How often he pushed away tenderness because he did not know how to receive it without feeling exposed. And now he may realize, the mask protected me, but it also isolated me. That is a painful truth, because it shows him that survival came with a cost. And awakening asks him whether he is willing to keep paying it. Will he keep choosing the mask because it is familiar? Or will he begin choosing truth because he is tired of being divided from himself? This is not a simple choice. Because removing the mask means facing what the mask has been covering. If the mask covered grief, grief may rise. If the mask covered longing, longing may return. If the mask covered fear, fear must be met. If the mask covered love, love may become undeniable. That is why the collapse can feel like emotional exposure. The divine masculine may feel as if everything he has controlled is becoming visible. Not necessarily to the world, but to himself. The tenderness he denied, the vulnerability he feared, the ache of connection, the regret over silence, the truth that he has not been as untouched as he wanted to believe. And this can make him want to rebuild the mask. He may feel the old instinct. Get colder. Stay busy. Say less. Act normal. Do not let anyone know. Do not let the heart become too visible. But now the old instinct has competition. The awakened heart. The awakened heart says, you are tired because this is not who you are. You are lonely because the mask cannot love. You are restless because the truth wants to breathe. You are not weak for feeling. You are exhausted from pretending not to. That voice may be quiet, but it is powerful, because it speaks from a place deeper than fear. And the more he hears it, the more difficult it becomes to keep living only from the mask. This is where the divine masculine begins to understand something important. The mask is not masculinity. The mask is protection. The mask is not strength. The mask is survival. The mask is not truth. The mask is fear trying to look unbreakable. And once he realizes this, the entire definition of strength begins to shift. He may begin to see that real strength is not never being moved. Real strength is being honest about what moves him. Real strength is not appearing unaffected. Real strength is facing the places where he has been affected and allowing them to teach him. Real strength is not silence. Real strength is communication with courage. This is the birth of a new masculine understanding. A masculinity that does not have to deny the heart. A masculinity that can hold tenderness without shame. A masculinity that can admit fear without being ruled by it. A masculinity that can love without hiding behind emotional distance. But before that new strength becomes stable, the old mask must lose authority. And that can feel like a collapse. Because the ego may experience truth as danger. It may say, if you admit this mattered, you lose power. It may say, if you speak honestly, you expose yourself. It may say, if you let the mask fall, you will be rejected, judged, misunderstood, or abandoned. These fears may not be imaginary. They may come from real experiences. Maybe he opened once and was dismissed. Maybe he needed comfort and was shamed. Maybe he expressed emotion and was told to toughen up. Maybe he learned that being vulnerable made him unsafe. Maybe he built the mask because the world around him did not know how to honor his tenderness. So the mask had a reason. But a reason is not a destiny. That is what awakening teaches him. He can honor why the mask was created without letting it rule the rest of his life. He can understand that the mask helped him survive without confusing survival with freedom. He can see that the wall once protected a wound, but now the wound needs healing, not more walls. That is emotional maturity. Not hating the mask. Understanding it. Thanking it for what it once did. Then slowly learning how to live without obeying it. This process may be gradual. He may not remove the mask in one moment. He may begin with small acts of honesty. A sentence he would not have said before. A pause before shutting down. An admission that he is overwhelmed. A willingness to look at his own fear instead of projecting it onto the connection. He may begin to say, I do not know how to talk about this, but I know I cannot keep pretending. I thought I was protecting myself, but maybe I have been hiding. I feel more than I wanted to admit. I am scared of what happens when I let people close. These are not small sentences for a man who has lived behind a mask. They are breakthroughs. Because every honest word creates a crack in the old performance. Every moment of vulnerability teaches him that truth does not have to destroy him. Every time he lets himself be seen a little more, the mask becomes less necessary. This is how the collapse becomes healing. Not by falling apart without meaning, but by letting what is false fall away so something real can stand. That is the sacred beauty of this stage. The collapse of the masculine mask is not the collapse of the man. It is the collapse of the lie that he had to hide his heart to be strong. It is the collapse of the belief that numbness is peace. It is the collapse of the old identity that told him emotional distance made him powerful. And beneath that collapse, something more authentic can rise. The real man. The man who feels. The man who knows. The man who can grieve. The man who can love. The man who can stop performing strength and begin embodying truth. That is the man the soul has been trying to awaken. But he must choose to let him rise. Because the mask will not fall without resistance. He may still reach for it when he feels exposed. He may still hide behind it when he is afraid. He may still use it in moments when tenderness feels too close. But each time he does, he may feel the heaviness more clearly. And eventually, that heaviness becomes its own teacher. It teaches him that hiding is exhausting. It teaches him that being unreachable is lonely. It teaches him that control is not the same as connection. It teaches him that if he wants real love, he cannot keep sending the mask in his place. That is a powerful realization. Because many divine masculines want to be loved, but they send the mask to receive love for them. They show the controlled version, the distant version, the unaffected version, the version that never fully reveals the heart. And then they wonder why the connection does not feel deeply safe. But love cannot fully meet a mask. Love can only meet truth. And if he wants the kind of connection his soul recognizes, he must eventually risk being real. Not perfect. Real. Not fully healed. Honest. Not fearless. Willing. Willing to let the mask soften. Willing to let the heart speak. Willing to admit that the performance has cost him too much. That is the threshold of chapter 5. And for you, this chapter carries a clear message. If you can sense his mask cracking, that may be meaningful. You may feel that he is not as unaffected as he appears. You may sense the exhaustion beneath his control, the truth beneath his silence, the tenderness beneath the performance. But do not fall in love only with the man beneath the mask while ignoring the man who is still choosing to wear it. Both matter. His hidden heart may be real, but his visible behavior still affects you. His tenderness may exist beneath the surface. But if the mask is what shows up, the mask is what you experience. His awakening may be beginning. But until it becomes honesty, consistency, and emotional responsibility, you must still protect your own peace. That is not judgment. That is wisdom. Because you are not here to spend your life trying to convince a man to remove the mask he must choose to take off himself. You are not here to keep loving potential while your own heart receives distance. You are not here to decode every crack in his armor while neglecting the places in you that need safety. You can honor his process, but you must honor your own heart too. If his mask is collapsing, let him meet that collapse with courage. Let him learn what the performance has cost him. Let him feel the exhaustion of pretending. Let him discover that the old identity cannot take him where love is asking him to go. And while he does that, stay rooted in yourself. Because the awakening of the divine masculine does not require the disappearance of the divine feminine into waiting, proving, or rescuing. Your awakening matters too. Maybe his mask is collapsing. And maybe your illusion is collapsing too. The illusion that hidden feelings are enough. The illusion that potential can replace presence. The illusion that if you understand his wounds deeply enough, you must accept the pain they create. That illusion may need to fall as well. Because true spiritual connection does not ask one person to remain emotionally undernourished while the other person slowly learns how to be real. True connection requires truth on both sides. His truth may be, I am tired of pretending. Your truth may be, I deserve someone who does not only feel deeply beneath the mask, but shows up with honesty in the open. Both truths can coexist. And if the connection is meant to mature, it must honor both. That is the sacred truth of chapter 5. The divine masculine starts awakening more deeply when the masculine mask begins to collapse. The image of being unaffected, controlled, numb, distant, and emotionally untouchable no longer feels like strength. It begins to feel like exhaustion, loneliness, and separation from the truth. The mask may have once protected him, but awakening shows him that it cannot lead him into real love, healing, or emotional freedom. And when he understands that, the old self begins to lose its grip. The performance weakens. The hidden heart rises. The man beneath the mask begins to breathe. But once the mask cracks, another layer often follows. Grief. Grief for what he denied. Grief for how long he hid. Grief for what fear cost him. Grief for the tenderness he pushed away because he did not know how to stand in it. That is where we go next. If this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for chapter 6. Because next we are going deeper into the grief that opens the door to truth, and why the pain he has been avoiding may become the very doorway into his most honest awakening. Chapter 6. The grief that opens the door to truth. Sometimes the divine masculine does not awaken through joy first. Sometimes he awakens through grief. That is where this chapter begins. Because once the old story stops working, once silence becomes too loud, once he begins to see his pattern, once the connection reveals itself as a mirror, and once the masculine mask begins to crack, something deeper often rises from beneath all of it. Grief. Not just sadness. Not just missing. Not just emotional discomfort. But grief. The grief of realizing what he denied. The grief of seeing what fear cost him. The grief of remembering what he pushed away. The grief of feeling how long he has been separated from his own heart. And this grief can be one of the most powerful turning points in his awakening. Because grief has a way of breaking through the places pride cannot reach. Pride can argue. Pride can defend. Pride can justify. Pride can say, I did what I had to do. Pride can say, it was not that serious. Pride can say, I am fine. But grief does not care about the performance. Grief enters quietly, and suddenly the excuses feel weaker. He may sit alone and feel the weight of everything he refused to feel. He may remember your softness. He may remember a moment where he could have spoken, but stayed silent. He may remember the way he pulled away when the connection asked him to be honest. He may remember the version of himself who chose control, not because love was absent, but because fear was stronger. And in that memory, grief begins to open the door. Because grief says, this mattered. This touched you. This was not nothing. You were not as unaffected as you pretended to be. That is why grief can become sacred. It brings him closer to truth than logic ever could. For a long time, the divine masculine may have tried to think his way around the connection. He may have used logic to explain the intensity. He may have used timing to excuse the distance. He may have used practicality to avoid emotional responsibility. He may have used silence to keep the truth from becoming spoken. But grief does not ask him to think. Grief asks him to feel. And feeling is what he has been avoiding. So when grief rises, he may resist it at first. He may try to push it down. He may try to distract himself. He may become frustrated that he still feels anything at all. He may judge himself for the heaviness in his chest, for the memories that keep returning, for the tenderness that appears when he thought he had already closed the door. He may ask, why does this still hurt? Why am I feeling this now? Why do I miss what I did not know how to hold? Why does the silence feel heavier than it used to feel? These questions are not signs that he is weak. They are signs that the truth is rising. Because grief often appears when the soul is no longer willing to let the ego control the story. The ego may say, move on. But grief says, feel what happened. The ego may say, stay strong. But grief says, strength without honesty is only hiding. The ego may say, do not look back. But grief says, there is something there you still need to understand. That is the doorway. Grief does not open the door to punish him. It opens the door to bring him into honesty. And honesty is where awakening becomes real. Because before grief, he may still believe the old explanations. He may still believe that he was simply protecting himself. He may still believe that silence was the safest option. He may still believe that distance was wisdom. But grief starts revealing the cost. It shows him that silence may have protected his pride, but it did not protect the connection. It shows him that distance may have reduced his fear, but it also increased his loneliness. It shows him that numbness may have helped him function, but it also kept him from feeling the love, tenderness, and truth that were trying to reach him. This is where the divine masculine begins to see that avoidance was never free. It had a price, and sometimes the price was the very thing his soul wanted most: emotional closeness, truth, tenderness, a safe place to be seen, a connection where he did not have to perform strength all the time. That realization can hurt, because he may begin to understand that he did not only lose something outside of himself, he also lost contact with something inside himself. The part that wanted to stay open, the part that wanted to speak honestly, the part that wanted to be brave enough to receive love without turning it into danger. And when he sees that, grief deepens, because now he is not only grieving the connection, he is grieving the man he could have been inside it, the man who could have stayed, the man who could have spoken, the man who could have chosen honesty earlier, the man who could have protected tenderness instead of hiding from it. This is one of the hardest forms of grief, the grief of recognizing your own absence. Not physical absence only, emotional absence. The moments where he was there, but not fully there. The conversations where he heard you, but did not reveal himself. The closeness where he felt something, but refused to honor it. The silence where he told himself he was staying safe, while another heart was left holding unanswered questions. That kind of grief humbles him. And humility is often the doorway into awakening. Because the masculine mask cannot survive true humility for long. The mask needs pride. The mask needs denial. The mask needs the story that he had no choice. The mask needs the illusion that control was always strength. But grief begins to soften those defenses. It says, look again. Look at what happened. Look at what you avoided. Look at what you felt. Look at what you did with what you felt. Look at how fear shaped the choices your heart never fully agreed with. This is not easy to face, but it is necessary. Because without grief, he may stay trapped in the surface explanation. He may keep telling himself the story that makes him feel less responsible. He may keep calling emotional absence space. He may keep calling fear discernment. He may keep calling silence peace. But grief refuses to let the story stay clean. It brings back the emotional truth. The ache, the memory, the tenderness, the regret, the human weight of what was never fully felt. And in that weight, the soul begins to speak. It may say, you cared. You were afraid. You ran. You lost something when you hid. You are tired because you have been carrying the truth without honoring it. That voice can be painful, but it can also be liberating. Because once he allows himself to grieve, he no longer has to keep pretending that nothing mattered. He no longer has to fight so hard to maintain the image of being untouched. He no longer has to use numbness to hold back the feelings that were always trying to lead him into a more honest life. Grief gives him permission to stop lying. And sometimes that is the first real breath of awakening. He may finally admit to himself, I was not fine. I did care. I was afraid of how much I felt. I did not know how to stay open. I lost something real when I chose silence over truth. These admissions may not come all at once. They may come in fragments. A feeling one night. A thought in the morning. A memory that breaks through. A moment where he stops defending himself and simply feels the weight of what is true. But each fragment matters. Because every honest fragment brings him closer to himself. And this is what grief does when it becomes sacred. It does not only show him what he lost. It shows him what he needs to reclaim. His honesty. His tenderness. His courage. His ability to feel without running. His willingness to be present when love asks him to become real. That is why grief is not the enemy of awakening. Grief is often the beginning of emotional truth. Because when he grieves, he stops treating the heart like something to control. He begins to understand that the heart has its own intelligence. It knows what mattered. It knows what was avoided. It knows what remains unfinished. It knows when the soul has been living beneath a mask for too long. And the heart will keep asking to be heard. Not to trap him in the past, but to free him from repeating it. That is important, Grief is not meant to keep him stuck. It is meant to teach him. If he listens, grief can show him the difference between regret and responsibility. Regret says, "I wish I had done it differently." Responsibility says, "I will become more conscious so I do not keep repeating this." Regret feels the pain. Responsibility lets the pain mature him. That is the shift. And the awakening divine masculine must eventually make that shift. Because if he only grieves but does not grow, grief becomes another emotional wave that passes through without transformation. He may feel sad. He may miss. He may regret. But then, when vulnerability appears again, he may still choose the old pattern. That is not awakening. That is only emotional intensity. True awakening asks more of him. It asks him to let grief become wisdom. Wisdom that says, "Next time, speak before silence becomes damage. Next time, tell the truth before fear turns into distance. Next time, do not call emotional avoidance strength. Next time, do not wait until something is gone to admit that it mattered." This is where grief becomes a teacher. A painful teacher, but a holy one. Because it teaches him that love is not only something to feel after the fact. Love is something to honor while it is present. Tenderness is not something to mourn only after pushing it away. It is something to protect when it arrives. Truth is not something to discover only in absence. It is something to speak when the heart is still open. This realization can change him deeply. It can make him more careful, more humble, more emotionally aware, more aware of how his silence affects others, more aware that his fear does not excuse every consequence. And this is where his grief begins to open the door to relational maturity. He may begin to understand that awakening is not only about what he feels inside. It is also about how he shows up outside. It is not enough to miss someone silently. It is not enough to feel regret privately. It is not enough to know the connection mattered if he still refuses to bring truth into the open. The awakened masculine learns that feelings must become responsibility. If he feels grief, he must ask what it is teaching him. If he feels regret, he must ask what needs to change. If he feels tenderness, he must ask how to honor it without hiding. If he feels love, he must ask whether he has the courage to meet love with honesty, not only longing. This is the doorway that grief opens. A doorway into truth. Not fantasy. Not self-punishment. Not emotional collapse. Truth. The truth that he was afraid. The truth that he cared. The truth that he avoided. The truth that he must grow if he wants to stop living the same pattern. And for many divine masculines, this is the moment awakening becomes serious. Because grief strips away the romance of avoidance. Before grief, avoidance may have seemed powerful. After grief, avoidance begins to look like loss. Before grief, silence may have felt safe. After grief, silence begins to feel like everything he never had the courage to say. Before grief, the mask may have felt strong. After grief, the mask begins to feel like the reason he was never fully met. That is a deep shift. And it may bring him to his knees internally, not necessarily outwardly. He may not show the world everything he feels, but inside he may be humbled. He may finally feel the truth beneath the defense. He may finally understand that the heart cannot be managed forever like an inconvenience. The heart must be met. And if he refuses to meet it, the grief will keep returning in different forms. Different memories. Different relationships. Different moments of silence. Different versions of the same lesson. Because the soul repeats what the ego refuses to learn. That is why this chapter matters. The grief that opens the door to truth is not random sadness. It is the soul trying to complete an unfinished lesson. It is the emotional body bringing back what was denied. It is the hidden heart asking to be integrated instead of abandoned. And if he has courage, he can let grief soften him instead of harden him. That is the choice. Grief can make him close again. Or grief can make him real. If he closes, he may say, "This is why I should never feel too much." If he awakens, he may say, "This is why I must learn how to feel with more courage." If he closes, he may blame love for the pain. If he awakens, he may see that fear shaped the pain. If he closes, he may build a stronger mask. If he awakens, he may finally begin removing it. That is the sacred fork in the road. Because grief does not automatically awaken a man. Some men use grief to become colder. But the divine masculine who is truly awakening allows grief to make him more truthful, more compassionate, more accountable, more willing to stop hiding from himself. He begins to understand that the pain is not here to destroy his masculinity. It is here to mature it. It is here to show him that strength without feeling becomes isolation. Control without tenderness becomes emptiness. Silence without honesty becomes regret. And once he sees that, the old way loses its shine. He may no longer want to be the man who can walk away without feeling. He may no longer want to be the man who stays silent when truth is needed. He may no longer want to be the man who only understands love after distance has made the lesson painful. He may begin to want something different. A new kind of strength. A strength that can speak. A strength that can grieve. A strength that can stay present. A strength that can say, I was afraid, but I am learning not to let fear make every choice for me. That is the awakened masculine beginning to rise. Not perfect, but honest. Not fully healed, but willing. Not free from grief, but finally listening to what grief came to teach. And for you, this chapter carries its own message. If he is grieving, if something in him is beginning to feel the weight of what happened, that may be part of his awakening. But his grief is still his responsibility. His sadness is not your assignment to soothe. His regret is not your invitation to abandon your boundaries. His emotional awakening does not automatically mean he is ready to love you with maturity. Let his grief teach him. Do not interrupt the lesson by becoming the comfort that helps him avoid responsibility. Sometimes people want relief from regret before they have fully learned from it. Sometimes they want forgiveness before they have faced impact. Sometimes they want access to your softness before they have become safe enough to receive it with care. So remain compassionate, but remain clear. You can honor the grief that is opening him without making yourself responsible for what he does next. You can understand that he is facing truth without assuming that truth has already become transformation. You can wish him healing without stepping back into a pattern that has not yet changed. Because your heart matters too. Your grief matters too. Your truth matters too. Maybe he is grieving what he denied. And maybe you are grieving what you accepted for too long. Maybe he is realizing that silence cost him. And maybe you are realizing that silence cost you too. Maybe he is learning that fear is not wisdom. And maybe you are learning that waiting for someone else's courage is not your purpose. Both awakenings are sacred. This is not only his journey. It is yours too. Because the exact moment the divine masculine starts awakening may be the moment his grief opens the door to truth. But the exact moment you start awakening more deeply may be the moment you stop making his grief more important than your own peace. That is balance. That is self-respect. That is spiritual maturity. So let him grieve what needs to be grieved. Let him feel the cost of the mask. Let him understand what silence did. Let him meet the truth that he can no longer outrun. And you return to yourself. Not in anger. Not in punishment. But in sacred clarity. Because if his grief becomes true awakening, it will not only make him sad. It will make him responsible. It will make him honest. It will make him more careful with tenderness. It will make him less willing to hide behind the old masculine mask. And if it does not, then grief may be present, but awakening is still incomplete. That is the truth. Feeling grief is not the final proof. Growing from grief is. That is where Chapter 6 leaves us. With the understanding that grief opens the door to truth because it breaks through the old defenses and reveals what the divine masculine could no longer deny. It shows him what mattered, what he avoided, what fear cost him, and where he must become more honest if he wants to stop repeating the same pattern. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 7. Because next we are going deeper into when he stops blaming the connection and starts facing himself, and why the moment he asks, "What in me is afraid of this?" becomes one of the most powerful turning points in his awakening. Chapter 7. when he stops blaming the connection and starts facing himself. There comes a moment when the divine masculine stops asking, "Why is this connection doing this to me?" and starts asking, "What inside me is being revealed by this connection?" That is where this chapter begins. Because for a long time, he may have looked outward for the explanation. He may have told himself the connection was too intense. The timing was too complicated. The emotions were too confusing. The pull was too strong. The situation was too uncomfortable. You were too close, too perceptive, too emotionally present, too capable of seeing what he was not ready to reveal. And maybe the connection was intense. Maybe the timing was complicated. Maybe the emotions were difficult to understand. Maybe your presence did reach him in a way that felt overwhelming. But awakening begins when he stops using those things as the full explanation. Because the deeper truth is this: the connection did not create everything he feels. It revealed what was already inside him. It revealed the fear beneath his control. It revealed the tenderness beneath his distance. It revealed the longing beneath his independence. It revealed the wound beneath his silence. It revealed the hidden heart beneath the masculine mask. And when he begins to see that, something powerful shifts. He stops blaming the mirror and starts facing the reflection. That is one of the most sacred turning points in the awakening journey. Because blaming the connection keeps him outside of himself. It lets him believe the problem is the intensity, the other person, the timing, the pull, the uncertainty, or the emotional pressure. It keeps the focus on what is happening around him instead of what is happening within him. But facing himself changes everything. Now he must ask, why does closeness make me want to run? Why does tenderness feel like exposure? Why does being seen feel like danger? Why do I call emotional depth too much when it may simply be touching what I have not healed? Why do I keep treating love like something I have to survive? These are not easy questions, but they are awakening questions. Because they move him from reaction into self-inquiry, from defense into responsibility, from avoidance into the first real possibility of transformation. Before this moment, he may have thought the connection was the disturbance. After this moment, he begins to understand that the connection disturbed what was already unresolved. That is a completely different level of awareness. It means he can no longer say, "She made me feel vulnerable," without also asking, "Why does vulnerability frighten me so much?" He can no longer say, "This connection makes me confused," without asking, "Is it confusion, or am I afraid of clarity?" He can no longer say, "I need distance from her," without asking, "Am I actually trying to distance myself from the truth rising inside me?" That inner shift is the beginning of spiritual maturity. Because immaturity blames the trigger. Maturity studies the wound. Immaturity says, "This is too much." Maturity asks, "What part of me cannot hold this yet?" Immaturity says, "She is making me feel things." Maturity asks, "Why have I been so disconnected from my own feelings?" Immaturity says, "I need to escape." Maturity asks, "What am I afraid will happen if I stay present?" This is how the divine masculine begins to turn inward. And turning inward can feel uncomfortable. Because when he stops blaming the connection, he loses one of his favorite hiding places. He can no longer make the intensity the enemy. He can no longer make your emotional depth the problem. He can no longer make timing, pressure, or uncertainty the only reason he is afraid. He has to face the real source of the fear. And the real source may be old. Older than you. Older than this connection. Older than the current moment. Maybe he learned long ago that closeness was unsafe. Maybe he learned that emotional needs were inconvenient. Maybe he learned that being vulnerable meant being rejected, controlled, shamed, or abandoned. Maybe he learned that the safest way to survive was to stay guarded, unreadable, and emotionally self-contained. So when your connection touched him deeply, the fear that rose may not have been only about you. It may have been the old wound waking up. That is why he may have blamed the connection. Because blaming the connection is easier than facing the wound. It is easier to say, "This is too intense," than to say, "I am afraid of intimacy." It is easier to say, "I need space," than to say, "I do not know how to stay open when someone sees me." It is easier to say, I am confused, than to say, part of me knows this matters, and that terrifies me. It is easier to say, the timing is wrong, than to say, I am not yet emotionally mature enough to meet what this connection is asking of me. Those deeper truths require humility. And humility is often the doorway pride avoids. But once the divine masculine begins to awaken, pride becomes less satisfying. It may still rise. It may still defend. It may still try to protect the mask. But underneath it, a quieter truth begins asking to be heard. That truth says, stop blaming what revealed you. Start healing what was revealed. That sentence can change everything. Because the connection may have revealed his fear, but it is not responsible for healing it. The connection may have awakened his longing, but it is not responsible for regulating it. The connection may have shown him his pattern, but it is not responsible for changing it. That work belongs to him. And this is where his awakening becomes more accountable. He begins to understand that if he runs, that is his reaction. If he goes silent, that is his pattern. If he becomes cold after vulnerability, that is his defense. If he pushes away tenderness, that is his wound asking to be understood. This does not mean he should blame himself with cruelty. It means he should finally see himself with honesty. There is a difference. Blame says, I am bad. Honesty says, I am responsible for understanding what I do. Blame creates shame. Honesty creates growth. Blame makes him hide. Honesty helps him change. That is the pathway he must learn. Because if he falls into shame, he may run back to the old story. He may say, I am just not good at this, and use that as a reason to stay the same. He may think, I always ruin things, and collapse into self-punishment instead of responsibility. He may feel the weight of what he has avoided and become even more distant because he does not know how to repair it. But awakening does not ask him to punish himself. It asks him to become conscious. To say, I see where I ran. I see where I blamed the connection. I see where I used silence to avoid vulnerability. I see where my fear created distance. I see that the intensity was not the enemy. The intensity showed me what I need to heal. That is not shame. That is power. Because the moment he takes responsibility for his inner world, he begins reclaiming his freedom. Before responsibility, fear runs the pattern. After responsibility, awareness can interrupt it. Before responsibility, every deep connection becomes a threat. After responsibility, a deep connection becomes a teacher. Before responsibility, he keeps asking, why does this keep happening to me? After responsibility, he begins asking, what am I being asked to learn? That question is sacred, because it turns pain into initiation. It turns confusion into self-knowledge. It turns emotional intensity into a doorway. And once he begins seeing the connection this way, he may feel less need to fight it. He may no longer see the connection as something trying to overpower him. He may begin to understand it as something that revealed where he was still asleep. This does not mean he suddenly knows what to do. It does not mean the connection becomes easy. It does not mean he is ready to show up perfectly. But it does mean the direction of his attention changes. He begins looking inward. And inward is where awakening deepens. He may begin to notice that his fear rises at very specific moments. When someone sees him clearly. When tenderness becomes mutual. When he feels emotionally safe enough to soften. When he realizes he needs more than he expected. When the connection asks him to be honest instead of controlled. Those moments are not random. They are doorways into the wound. And instead of running from them, he may begin to study them. Why did I shut down right there? Why did I become cold after that conversation? Why did her softness make me feel exposed? Why did I want to disappear after feeling close? These questions are the beginning of emotional intelligence. Because emotional intelligence is not only knowing what he feels. It is understanding why he reacts the way he does. It is seeing the connection between fear and behavior, between memory and defense, between old pain and current distance, between the wound he carries and the way he handles love. That is how the pattern begins to transform. He starts realizing that he can feel fear without obeying it automatically. He can feel overwhelmed without disappearing. He can feel tenderness without mocking it, denying it, or turning it into distance. He can feel exposed without deciding that exposure means danger. This is the new lesson. Feeling is not the enemy. Unconscious reaction is. The connection is not the enemy. Unhealed fear is. Vulnerability is not the enemy. The belief that vulnerability equals danger is. That shift is profound. Because once he stops blaming the connection, he stops fighting the wrong thing. He stops fighting the person, the bond, the intensity, the tenderness, the longing. He begins to face what truly needs his attention. His own relationship with love. His own fear of being seen. His own tendency to equate emotional closeness with loss of control. His own resistance to receiving the kind of connection his soul may actually crave. This is where the divine masculine may begin to feel both humbled and empowered. Humbled because he sees the role he played in his own avoidance. Empowered because he realizes he is not doomed to repeat it forever. If the problem is only outside of him, he has no power except to escape. But if the pattern is inside him, then he can heal. He can learn. He can change. He can choose differently. He can become more conscious in the exact places where he used to disappear. That is the sacred gift of facing himself. It returns power to him. Not control. Power. Control says, avoid what makes you feel. Power says, understand what makes you run. Control says, stay distant so you cannot be hurt. Power says, develop the strength to stay present with truth. Control says, blame the connection. Power says, learn from what the connection revealed. That is awakened masculine power. And it is far deeper than the old mask. The old mask could only protect him from vulnerability. The awakened masculine can meet vulnerability with awareness. The old mask could only create distance. The awakened masculine can create honesty. The old mask could only say, I am fine. The awakened masculine can say, I am afraid, and I am willing to understand why. That willingness is the beginning of real growth. But for you, this chapter carries an important message too. If he is beginning to face himself, that may be meaningful. It may mean his awakening is moving beyond feeling into self-responsibility. It may mean he is no longer only blaming timing, intensity, or you. It may mean he is beginning to see the deeper wound. But again, awareness must become action. It is not enough for him to realize, this is my fear. If he still uses that fear to create distance without care. It is not enough for him to say, I know I avoid, if he keeps avoiding. It is not enough for him to understand that the connection was a mirror if he refuses to mature through what it revealed. Facing himself is sacred. But it must become embodied. It must become communication. It must become accountability. It must become changed behavior. It must become the courage to stop making another heart pay for wounds he has not yet healed. That is the standard. And you are allowed to hold that standard without guilt. You can have compassion for his self-discovery while still requiring emotional safety. You can honor that he is facing himself without becoming responsible for helping him face himself. You can recognize his awakening without making your life depend on how quickly he integrates it. Because his inner work is his. And your peace is yours. Do not confuse being a mirror with being a savior. Do not confuse understanding his fear with accepting repeated emotional harm. Do not confuse his potential for growth with the actual presence of maturity. The connection may have revealed his wounds, but it may also reveal your own. Your tendency to wait. Your tendency to over-explain. Your tendency to feel responsible for someone else's awakening. Your tendency to see his hidden heart while ignoring your own need for consistency. And maybe this connection is asking you to face yourself too. Not because you are wrong, but because awakening happens on both sides. For him, the question may be, what in me is afraid of this love? For you, the question may be, what in me keeps waiting for someone who is afraid to meet me fully? Both questions are holy. Both questions lead inward. Both questions invite healing. That is the deeper balance of this stage. He stops blaming the connection and starts facing himself. And you stop blaming yourself and start honoring yourself. He learns that his fear is his responsibility. You learn that his fear is not your identity. He learns that the connection was a mirror. You learn that you do not have to stay forever in front of someone who refuses to look. That is mutual awakening. Because the exact moment the divine masculine starts awakening is not only about him realizing the truth of the connection. It is about him realizing the truth of himself. And when he does, the connection is no longer just something he wants, fears, or misses. It becomes a sacred mirror. A mirror that asks him to become more honest than he has ever been. More conscious. More accountable. More emotionally present. More willing to stop treating fear as wisdom. And if he accepts that invitation, everything can begin to change. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But sincerely. Because the man who faces himself is already different from the man who only runs. The man who asks, "What is this showing me?" is already different from the man who says, "This is too much." The man who recognizes his wound is already standing closer to healing than the man who keeps blaming the mirror. That is why Chapter 7 matters so deeply. It is the moment awakening becomes self-responsibility. The divine masculine stops blaming the connection and begins facing the part of himself that the connection revealed. He starts to understand that the intensity was not the enemy, it was the illumination. The fear was not proof that the connection was wrong. It was proof that something inside him needed healing. And once he sees that, he stands before a sacred choice. Will he keep defending the old wound? Or will he finally begin healing it? Will he keep blaming what reveals him? Or will he honor the mirror and become the man truth is calling him to be? That is where Chapter 7 leaves us. With the understanding that awakening deepens when he stops projecting his fear onto the connection and starts asking what his fear is trying to show him. This is the moment he begins moving from avoidance into accountability, from blame into self-awareness, from emotional reaction into the possibility of true masculine maturity. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 8. Because next we are going deeper into the first honest conversation he has with himself, and why the truth he finally admits in private may become the first real confession of his awakening. Chapter 8. The first honest conversation he has with himself. Before the divine masculine speaks the truth to anyone else, he must first speak it to himself. That is where this chapter begins. Because awakening does not always begin with a message. It does not always begin with an apology. It does not always begin with a confession, a return, or a sudden emotional breakthrough that the outside world can see. Sometimes awakening begins in a private moment. A quiet room. A long drive. A sleepless night. A silence that finally becomes honest. And in that moment, he stops performing. Not for you. Not for the world. Not for the version of himself he has been trying to protect. Just for one breath, he stops pretending. And the first honest conversation begins. It may not sound dramatic. It may not be poetic. It may not be perfectly clear. It may not come with all the answers. But it carries something powerful because, for the first time, he is no longer using the old story to hide from the truth. He may finally say to himself, "I felt something. I was scared. I ran. I pretended it did not matter because admitting it mattered would have exposed me." That is not a small moment. That is sacred. Because the divine masculine can spend so long avoiding emotional truth that the first real confession is not spoken out loud. It happens inside his own chest. It happens when the mask slips in private. It happens when the defenses become tired and the soul finally speaks louder than pride. This is the first honest conversation he has with himself. And it changes everything. Because until he can tell himself the truth, every outer conversation will still carry avoidance. He may say partial things. He may speak around the feeling. He may explain the situation without revealing the heart. He may talk about timing, stress, confusion, fear, or distance, but never touch the deeper truth underneath. But when he becomes honest with himself, the foundation begins to shift. Now he cannot keep saying, "I did not care," without feeling the lie. He cannot keep saying, "It was nothing," without remembering the weight. He cannot keep saying, "I only needed space," without seeing how much fear was inside that space. He cannot keep saying, "I was protecting my peace," without asking whether he was also protecting his pride. This inner honesty is where awakening becomes real. Because the deepest lies are not always the lies he tells other people. They are the lies he tells himself. The lie that he was unaffected. The lie that he was only being logical. The lie that silence was the mature choice. The lie that emotional distance meant emotional freedom. The lie that he could bury his feelings and remain whole. When those lies begin to collapse, the first true conversation begins. And it may feel uncomfortable. Because honesty does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it enters like a mirror he can no longer turn away from. It shows him the truth behind his silence, the fear behind his control, the longing behind his distance, the tenderness behind his numbness, the wound behind his need to stay untouchable. And he may not like what he sees. He may see that he pulled away not because the connection was meaningless, but because it became meaningful. He may see that he went silent not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much he did not know how to say. He may see that he called the connection complicated because the truth felt too vulnerable. That realization can be painful, but it is also liberating, because self-deception is exhausting. It takes energy to keep denying what the body remembers. It takes energy to keep burying what the heart keeps bringing back. It takes energy to keep defending a story that no longer feels true. It takes energy to keep wearing a mask in front of the world, and then wearing it again when he is alone. So when he finally tells himself the truth, even if the truth hurts, there may also be relief. A deep, quiet relief. The relief of no longer having to fight what he knows. The relief of saying, "Yes, this touched me." The relief of admitting, "Yes, I was afraid." The relief of recognizing, "Yes, I have been hiding." And sometimes that relief is the first breath of freedom. Because truth does not always solve the situation immediately. But truth ends the war with reality. That is why this chapter matters. The first honest conversation he has with himself is the moment he stops arguing with what his soul already knows. He stops trying to make the connection smaller than it was. He stops trying to reduce his feelings to something convenient. He stops trying to pretend the distance was only peace when part of it was fear. And when that inner argument ends, another kind of work begins. The work of accountability. Because once he admits the truth, he must ask what he will do with it. Will he honor it? Will he run again? Will he let it change him? Will he bury it beneath another layer of distraction? Will he become responsible for what he now knows? This is where awakening becomes serious. Because many people can feel truth. Fewer are willing to live differently because of it. The divine masculine may finally admit in private, "I cared." But the next question is, will he let that care mature into honesty? He may admit, "I was scared." But will he learn to communicate fear instead of hiding behind silence? He may admit, "I ran." But will he begin to understand why he runs, and what it costs when he does? That is the difference between emotional realization and true awakening. A realization says, "I see it now." Awakening says, "Now I must become different because I see it." This is why the first honest conversation is only the beginning. But it is a powerful beginning. Because once he has spoken truth inside himself, even silently, the old unconsciousness is broken. He may still resist. He may still move slowly. He may still need time to integrate what he has admitted. But the truth has entered the room. And truth, once admitted, does not easily return to sleep. It keeps working inside him. It may show up when he tries to go numb again. It may show up when he reaches for old excuses. It may show up when he tells himself he is fine. It may show up when silence starts to feel heavier than honesty. The truth becomes a quiet witness. And that witness may begin asking, are you going to keep hiding? Are you going to keep calling fear wisdom? Are you going to keep pretending the mask is peace? Are you going to keep running from the part of yourself that is finally trying to wake up? These questions may feel confronting, but they are not punishment. They are guidance. The soul is not trying to shame him. The soul is trying to bring him back into alignment. Because the divine masculine's first honest conversation with himself is not meant to destroy him. It is meant to reunite him with the parts of himself he abandoned in order to survive. The tender part, the grieving part, the longing part, the part that wanted love but did not know how to receive it without fear. For the first time, he may begin listening to those parts instead of silencing them. He may say, I understand why I hid. I understand why I was afraid. I understand why closeness felt dangerous. But I do not want to keep living from that fear. That is a sacred turning point. Because now the conversation is no longer only about what happened. It is about who he wants to become. Does he want to remain the man who feels deeply in silence and acts cold in the open? Does he want to remain the man who understands too late what he was too afraid to honor in the moment? Does he want to remain the man who protects himself so completely that he never allows himself to be truly met? Or does he want to become the man who can face his heart without running? These are the questions that shape the awakened masculine. And they are not easy. Because becoming honest means giving up the comfort of denial. It means he can no longer blame everything on timing, intensity, confusion, or the other person. It means he must see his own role clearly, his withdrawal, his silence, his fear, his emotional unavailability, his tendency to numb, hide, and return to control when the heart asks for courage. But seeing his role does not have to become self-hatred. This is important. True inner honesty is not the same as shame. Shame says, I am broken, so I should hide. Honesty says, I see where I am wounded and I can begin to heal. Shame says, I ruined everything. Honesty says, I must understand what happened and become more responsible. Shame says, I am not worthy of love. Honesty says, I must learn how to love without letting fear control me. That distinction is vital. Because if his first honest conversation becomes only shame, he may collapse back into avoidance. He may feel the weight of truth and decide it is too much. He may punish himself instead of learning. He may hide again because shame tells him that he cannot change. But if the conversation becomes responsibility, awakening deepens. He begins to understand that truth is not here to condemn him. Truth is here to mature him. It is here to show him the places where the old self has been running the pattern. It is here to show him where he needs healing. It is here to show him that the feelings he feared were not enemies. They were messengers leading him toward a more honest life. That is when the inner conversation becomes sacred. Because he is no longer only admitting pain. He is beginning to listen to wisdom. The wisdom inside regret. The wisdom inside longing. The wisdom inside grief. The wisdom inside the ache that keeps returning when he tries to ignore what mattered. Every feeling begins to carry a message. The regret may say, become accountable. The longing may say, stop shaming your need for connection. The grief may say, honor what you denied. The tenderness may say, your heart is still alive. The fear may say, here is the wound that still needs love. And if he listens, he begins to change. Slowly, perhaps. Imperfectly, certainly. But truly. He may begin to speak to himself with more courage. I do not want to keep disappearing when I feel exposed. I do not want to keep making silence carry what I am afraid to say. I do not want to keep pretending emotional distance is peace. I do not want to keep losing connection because I cannot admit when something matters. These inner statements matter because they become seeds of outer change. A man's behavior changes after his inner conversation changes. Before he can speak differently to another person, he must stop lying to himself. Before he can show up with more maturity, he must admit where he has been immature. Before he can repair anything outside, he must stop defending the patterns inside. That is why this stage is so important. It is private but powerful. Invisible but foundational. No one may applaud this moment. No one may know it happened. It may not look like a breakthrough from the outside. But inside him, something sacred is beginning to align. The heart and the truth are finally in the same room. And once that happens, the old mask cannot dominate the same way. It may still try. The old mask may say, do not admit this. But the honest self says, I already know. The old mask may say, stay silent. But the honest self says, silence is costing me. The old mask may say, "You are safe or numb." But the honest self says, "Numbness is not life." This is how awakening grows. Through inner truth repeated until it becomes stronger than old fear. And eventually, if he continues, the honest conversation with himself may begin to reach the outer world. He may become more willing to communicate. He may become more willing to apologize. He may become more willing to explain without blaming. He may become more willing to say, "I was afraid," instead of hiding behind confusion. He may become more willing to take responsibility for the silence, distance, or avoidance that once felt automatic. That is when awakening begins to become visible. But even then, the beginning was inside. The first confession was private. The first truth was whispered to himself. The first real turning point was not when he knew what to say to you. It was when he stopped denying what he knew inside himself. That is the sacred truth of Chapter 8. The divine masculine starts awakening more deeply when he has the first honest conversation with himself. He admits what the mask denied. He sees what fear was hiding. He confesses privately that he felt something, that he ran, that the connection mattered, that silence was not peace, and that the old way of coping is no longer enough. That private honesty becomes the foundation of everything that follows. But for you, there is a message here too. You may never witness this conversation. You may never know exactly when it happens. You may feel a shift, sense a change, notice something different in his energy, but the deepest part may happen beyond your view. And this is where you must remain centered. Do not wait for proof of his inner honesty before you honor your own truth. Do not put your life on pause because he may be having realizations in silence. Do not make his private awakening more important than your visible reality. Because even if his inner conversation is real, it must eventually become embodied through action, communication, accountability, and emotional maturity. Truth inside him is sacred. But truth must also become safe outside him. That is what matters in real connection. A man who has an honest conversation with himself has begun awakening. But a man who lives from that honesty is becoming mature. Those are different stages. So let him have his private awakening. Let him face the truth in the quiet. Let him admit what he has denied. Let him stop lying to himself. And you return to your own center. Because your awakening may be the moment you realize you do not need to hear his private confession to know what you deserve publicly. You deserve clarity. You deserve emotional safety. You deserve someone whose inner truth becomes outer integrity. You deserve love that does not only exist in hidden realizations, but in consistent, respectful, honest presence. That is not asking too much. That is asking for love to become real. And if he is truly awakening, his private truth will eventually ask him to become responsible in the open. It will ask him to speak. It will ask him to repair. It will ask him to stop disappearing. It will ask him to stop making fear the decision maker. It will ask him to become the kind of man who can meet truth with courage. That is where Chapter 8 leaves us. With the understanding that before the divine masculine can confess anything outwardly, he must first become honest inwardly. The first honest conversation he has with himself may be the first real confession of his awakening, because it is the moment he stops defending the lie and begins listening to the soul. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 9. Because next we are going deeper into when awareness begins turning into responsibility, and why the true sign of his awakening is not only what he realizes, but what he is finally willing to do differently because of it. Chapter 9. When awareness begins turning into responsibility. Awareness is the beginning of awakening. But responsibility is the proof that awakening is becoming real. That is where this chapter begins. Because the divine masculine may have a moment where he sees the truth. He may finally understand the old story. He may feel the silence becoming too loud. He may recognize his pattern. He may realize the connection was a mirror. He may feel the mask cracking. He may grieve what fear has cost him. He may stop blaming the connection and begin facing himself. He may even have the first honest conversation inside his own heart. But then comes the deeper question. What will he do with what he now knows? Because seeing the truth is sacred. But seeing the truth and doing nothing with it becomes another form of avoidance. He may know he pulls away when he feels too much. But will he learn how to stay present? He may know his silence created confusion. But will he learn how to communicate? He may know his fear has been leading him. But will he learn how to stop obeying it blindly? He may know the connection mattered. But will he honor that knowing with maturity, or only hold it privately where it asks nothing of him? That is the threshold of Chapter 9. The moment awareness begins turning into responsibility. And this is where the divine masculine's awakening becomes tested. Because awareness can feel powerful. It can create emotional intensity. It can bring tears, regret, reflection, longing, and the feeling that something deep is finally shifting inside him. But awareness alone does not repair what silence has damaged. Awareness alone does not rebuild trust. Awareness alone does not make him emotionally safe. Awareness alone does not change the pattern unless he allows it to become a different choice. This is why responsibility matters. Responsibility is what turns awakening from an inner experience into an embodied reality. It is the bridge between what he realizes and how he lives. Without responsibility, awakening remains private. With responsibility, awakening begins to affect the way he shows up. And that is the difference between a man who is only emotionally stirred and a man who is truly beginning to mature. A stirred man may say, "I understand now," and still repeat the same silence. A maturing man says, "I understand now, so I need to do something differently." A stirred man may feel regret. A maturing man lets regret become accountability. A stirred man may miss you. A maturing man asks whether his return would be respectful, honest, and safe. A stirred man may feel deeply. A maturing man learns how to handle deep feeling without creating chaos. That is the distinction. And it is everything. Because the divine masculine may begin awakening privately long before he becomes capable of loving publicly with maturity. He may feel a lot. He may process a lot. He may realize a lot. But the true sign that awakening is moving deeper is that he begins to become responsible for his inner world instead of making other people suffer because of it. He stops saying, "This is just how I am," and starts saying, "This is what I learned, and now I must heal it." He stops saying, "I needed space," as an explanation that excuses everything, and starts asking, "How can I take space without abandoning someone?" He stops saying, "I was confused," as a hiding place, and starts asking, "Was I confused or was I afraid of being honest?" This shift is subtle but profound. Because responsibility does not mean he suddenly has no fear. It means he stops letting fear become the entire decision maker. Responsibility does not mean he never needs time. It means he learns how to take time with care. Responsibility does not mean he has every answer. It means he becomes honest about not having answers instead of using silence to disappear. That is emotional maturity. The awakened masculine does not become awakened because he never feels overwhelmed. He becomes awakened because he stops using overwhelm as permission to hurt, abandon, confuse, or avoid. This is a major turning point. Because now he begins to understand that his inner wounds may explain his behavior, but they do not erase the impact of his behavior. His fear may be real, but the confusion his silence creates is real too. His overwhelm may be real, but the emotional uncertainty he leaves behind is real too. His difficulty with vulnerability may be real, but the other person's need for clarity is real too. This is where empathy begins to deepen, because responsibility requires him to widen beyond his own survival response. He begins to see that love is not only about what he feels inside. It is about how he handles what he feels in relation to another heart. That is a sacred shift. Before responsibility, everything is filtered through self-protection. How do I stay safe? How do I avoid pain? How do I keep control? How do I not feel too exposed? But when responsibility begins, the questions change. How do I tell the truth without causing unnecessary harm? How do I communicate my fear instead of disappearing into it? How do I respect another heart while I am still learning how to understand my own? How do I stop making my wounds the silent ruler of this connection? These are awakened questions. because they show that the divine masculine is no longer only trying to survive his emotions. He is trying to become conscious with them. And this is where his actions may begin to change. Maybe he reaches out differently. Not with vague energy. Not with mixed signals. Not only because loneliness becomes uncomfortable, but with honesty. Maybe he says, I know I went silent. Maybe he says, I was overwhelmed, but I should have communicated. Maybe he says, I am still sorting through what I feel, but I do not want to keep hiding behind distance. Maybe he says, I can see that my fear affected you, and I want to be more responsible with that. These kinds of words matter. Not because they fix everything instantly, but because they show movement from self-awareness into relational awareness. They show that he is not only feeling the truth, he is beginning to respect the impact of it. That is a sign of awakening becoming embodied. And sometimes the responsibility may not begin with a message to you. Sometimes it begins in his choices. He may stop feeding distractions that keep him numb. He may start therapy, journaling, prayer, meditation, or deeper self-reflection. He may begin noticing his triggers before they take over. He may stop blaming every emotional reaction on the connection. He may begin practicing communication in places where he used to shut down. These private choices matter too. Because responsibility is not only about returning to someone. It is about becoming someone. A man who can face himself. A man who can hold emotional truth. A man who can recognize fear without worshiping it. A man who can stop using silence as a shield. A man who can learn how to love without disappearing when love becomes real. That is the deeper transformation. And yet, responsibility also means he understands he is not entitled to access. This is important. If he has been silent, distant, avoidant, or inconsistent, then his awakening does not automatically erase the impact of those choices. His realization does not obligate anyone to reopen. His regret does not cancel another person's healing. His desire to speak does not mean the other heart must immediately receive him. The awakened divine masculine begins to understand this. He does not return demanding comfort. He does not return expecting instant forgiveness. He does not return only to relieve his guilt. He returns, if he returns, with humility, with respect, with accountability, with willingness to listen, with the understanding that his awakening may be meaningful, but trust must be rebuilt through consistent action. That is what separates true responsibility from emotional impulse. Emotional impulse says, I feel this now, so I need you to respond. Responsibility says, I feel this now, and I will honor your pace, your boundaries, and your healing. Emotional impulse says, I miss you, so I am coming back. Responsibility says, I miss you, but I need to be honest about what I can offer and what I still need to work on. Emotional impulse says, I regret what happened. Responsibility says, I regret what happened, and I am willing to understand the impact instead of making this only about my pain. This is maturity. And it is rare, because it asks him to move beyond the self-centeredness of fear. Fear is not always selfish on purpose, but it often becomes self-centered. It narrows his world to his own discomfort, his own overwhelm, his own need to feel safe, his own impulse to run. But responsibility widens him. It asks him to consider the connection, the other person, the consequences, and the integrity of his choices. That widening is part of his masculine awakening. The awakened masculine does not only feel more deeply. He becomes more accountable. He becomes less willing to let old wounds speak through careless behavior. He becomes less willing to let silence do damage. He becomes less willing to hide behind, I did not know what to say, when honesty, even imperfect honesty, would have been kinder than disappearing. This is where he begins to build inner authority. Not ego authority. Soul authority. Ego authority says, I do what protects my pride. Soul authority says, I do what honors truth. Ego authority says, I avoid discomfort. Soul authority says, I can face discomfort if it leads to integrity. Ego authority says, my fear is the most important thing. Soul authority says, my fear matters, but so does how I treat others while I am afraid. That is the awakened masculine becoming real. And this is the exact place where many men either grow or repeat. Because awareness gives him a choice. He can say, I know I do this, and continue doing it. Or he can say, I know I do this, and I am responsible for changing how I respond. The first keeps him trapped in the same cycle. The second begins the work of transformation. And transformation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like one honest text instead of silence. Sometimes it looks like pausing before shutting down. Sometimes it looks like saying, I need time, but I do not want to disappear. Sometimes it looks like apologizing without defending. Sometimes it looks like admitting fear without making it someone else's burden. Sometimes it looks like not returning to a connection until he is clear enough to do so with respect. These are mature choices. They may look simple from the outside, but for a man who has lived behind avoidance, they can be deeply significant. Because every responsible choice interrupts the old pattern. Every accountable word weakens the mask. Every honest action teaches his nervous system that vulnerability does not have to end in collapse. Every moment of integrity builds a new masculine self. That is how awakening becomes embodied. Not through beautiful realizations alone, through repeated choices that align with truth. And for you, this chapter carries a very important message. If he is becoming aware, that may be meaningful. But do not measure his awakening only by what he says he understands. Measure it by how responsibility begins to show up. Does he communicate with more care? Does he take accountability without turning it into self-pity? Does he respect your boundaries? Does he stop making excuses for the same avoidance? Does he show a willingness to do the inner work, whether or not he immediately gets access to you? Does he understand that your healing matters too? These are the signs that awareness is becoming responsibility. Because hidden feelings are not enough. Private regret is not enough. Spiritual recognition is not enough. A connection can be deep, but depth without responsibility can still hurt. So stay clear. You are not asking for too much when you require consistency. You are not being unspiritual when you need communication. You are not blocking love when you honor your boundaries. You are not rejecting his awakening when you refuse to be pulled back into a pattern that has not truly changed. You are honoring truth. Because awakening must be more than energy. It must become embodiment. It must become behavior. It must become the ability to love with care in the real world, not only feel deeply in silence. That is the standard of mature connection. And if he is truly awakening, responsibility will not feel like punishment to him. It will feel like the path home. Home to integrity. Home to emotional maturity. Home to a masculinity that can protect tenderness instead of hiding from it. Home to the man who no longer wants his fear to be stronger than his truth. That is the sacred meaning of Chapter 9. When awareness begins turning into responsibility, the divine masculine stops using his wounds as explanations that excuse the pattern. He begins to see that his fear may be real, but his choices still matter. His silence may come from overwhelm, but he must learn how to communicate. His awakening may begin inside, but it must eventually become action. This is the point where the awakening becomes visible. Not through perfection, but through accountability. Not through grand promises, but through consistent effort. Not through emotional intensity, but through the courage to do something different when the old pattern tries to take over. And maybe that is the first real sign that he is no longer only waking up. He is growing up. Emotionally, spiritually, relationally. He is beginning to understand that love is not only something that happens to him. Love is something he must become responsible enough to meet. That is where Chapter 9 leaves us. With the understanding that awareness is sacred, but responsibility is what transforms awareness into real awakening. The divine masculine truly begins to mature when he stops hiding behind what he now understands and starts allowing that understanding to change how he communicates, how he handles fear, how he repairs, and how he shows up. And if this chapter spoke to you, stay with me for Chapter 10. Because next we bring everything together with the sacred beginning of the awakened masculine. And why the exact moment he starts awakening is not when he becomes perfect, but when he becomes honest enough to stop running from himself. Chapter 10. The sacred beginning of the awakened masculine. The divine masculine does not start awakening when he becomes perfect. He starts awakening when he becomes honest. That is where the final chapter begins. Because the exact moment of awakening is not always the moment he reaches out. It is not always the moment he apologizes. It is not always the moment he returns, confesses, or finally says the words that were buried beneath silence for so long. Those moments may come later. But the awakening begins earlier. It begins in the private space where he can no longer run from himself. The moment the old story stops working. The moment silence becomes too loud. The moment he sees his own pattern. The moment he realizes the connection was a mirror. The moment the masculine mask begins to crack. The moment grief opens the door to truth. The moment he stops blaming the connection and starts facing himself. The moment he has the first honest conversation inside his own soul. The moment awareness begins turning into responsibility. That is where the awakened masculine begins. Not in perfection. In truth. Because for so long, he may have believed awakening would mean having no fear, no confusion, no resistance, no shame, no old wounds, no impulse to run. But real awakening does not mean fear disappears overnight. It means he finally stops letting fear lead him unconsciously. It means he can feel the fear and still ask, what is this showing me? It means he can feel the longing and stop calling it weakness. It means he can feel the tenderness and stop burying it beneath silence. It means he can look at his own distance and admit, this is not peace. This is protection. That is sacred. Because the divine masculine has often spent years surviving through emotional control. He may have used silence to avoid vulnerability. He may have used distance to avoid intimacy. He may have used logic to avoid grief. He may have used the masculine mask to avoid the hidden heart beneath it. But awakening begins when the mask can no longer convince him. He starts seeing the cost. The cost of silence. The cost of pretending. The cost of pushing away tenderness. The cost of acting unaffected when something inside him was deeply moved. And when he sees that cost, he begins to understand that the old way cannot take him where his soul is trying to go. The old way can keep him safe, but it cannot make him whole. The old way can protect him from exposure, but it cannot teach him how to love. The old way can keep him in control, but it cannot bring him into truth. That is why the beginning of the awakened masculine is so powerful. Because it is the moment he realizes that strength is not the same as numbness. Strength is not silence. Strength is not emotional distance. Strength is not pretending he does not care. Real strength is the courage to feel what is real and become responsible for it. That is the man he is being called to become. A man who can say, I was afraid, without hiding behind pride. A man who can say, I felt something, without reducing it to nothing. A man who can say, I pulled away, without blaming the connection for exposing him. A man who can say, I need to heal this pattern, instead of making another heart suffer because he refuses to face himself. That is the awakened masculine. Not flawless, but accountable. Not fearless, but willing. Not always certain, but honest enough to stop using confusion as a hiding place. And this is the sacred turning point. Because once he becomes honest, he can no longer live the old way without feeling the lie inside it. He may still feel the urge to run, but now he recognizes it. He may still feel the pull toward silence, but now silence feels different. He may still feel shame after opening, but now he begins to understand shame as a wound, not a command. He may still feel fear around love, but now he starts asking whether fear is protecting him from danger or keeping him from growth. That question changes everything. Because the awakened masculine is not born when he has all the answers. He is born when he starts asking better questions. What am I really afraid of? Why do I shut down when something reaches me? Why do I call distance peace when it leaves me lonely? Why do I keep protecting the mask when the heart is asking to be seen? What kind of man do I want to become now that I can no longer pretend I feel nothing? These questions are the beginning of inner freedom. Because a man who asks these questions is no longer fully asleep. He is no longer only reacting from wounds. He is no longer only repeating the old pattern without awareness. He is beginning to choose. And choice is where awakening becomes real. He can choose honesty over denial, communication over disappearance, responsibility over excuses, healing over repetition, truth over the old mask. That does not mean the journey becomes easy. It does not mean he suddenly knows how to love perfectly. It does not mean he instantly becomes emotionally available, consistent, or fully healed. Awakening is not a performance of perfection. Awakening is the willingness to stop abandoning truth. Again and again. When fear rises, he returns to truth. When shame rises, he returns to truth. When the old mask calls him back, he returns to truth. When silence feels easier than vulnerability, he remembers that ease is not always wisdom. That is how the awakened masculine grows. Step by step, choice by choice, truth by truth. And if he continues, his awakening begins to show in the way he lives. He becomes more careful with silence, more honest about overwhelm, more willing to communicate instead of disappear, more aware of how his fear affects other people, more capable of holding tenderness without turning it into distance. This is not just emotional growth. It is spiritual maturity. Because the divine masculine is not awakening only to the connection. He is awakening to himself, to the parts he abandoned, to the feelings he buried, to the wounds he minimized, to the love he wanted but feared, to the truth that his heart was never the enemy. And when he understands that, the entire journey changes. Love no longer looks like something he has to survive. Love becomes something he must learn how to meet. Vulnerability no longer looks like humiliation. Vulnerability becomes the doorway into a more honest life. Feeling deeply no longer looks like weakness. Feeling deeply becomes proof that the hidden heart is still alive. That is the sacred beginning of the awakened masculine. But now, here is the truth for you. His awakening is sacred. But it is not your responsibility to force it. You may have been the mirror. You may have been the catalyst. You may have been the softness that showed him where he was guarded. You may have been the connection that awakened something he could no longer numb. But you are not here to chase him into consciousness. You are not here to wait forever at the doorway of his courage. You are not here to abandon your peace just because you can feel his hidden truth. Because your awakening matters too. Maybe his awakening begins when he finally stops running from himself. And maybe yours begins when you stop running after someone who is not yet ready to meet you in truth. Maybe his lesson is learning how to feel. And maybe yours is learning how to honor your feelings without making them dependent on his timing. Maybe his path is to face the masculine mask. And maybe yours is to release the illusion that potential is enough without presence. Both awakenings are sacred. So do not confuse compassion with self-abandonment. Do not confuse patience with waiting in pain. Do not confuse spiritual connection with accepting emotional inconsistency. Do not confuse his private realization with the public maturity your heart deserves. Because love must become embodied. It must become honest. It must become safe. It must become responsible. It must become something that can breathe in the open, not only exist in silence, longing, or hidden regret. If he is truly awakening, his truth will eventually ask something of him. It will ask him to speak differently, to show up differently, to handle fear differently, to stop using silence as protection, to stop making the connection carry the weight of wounds he refuses to heal. And if he chooses that path, he will not become perfect, but he will become more real, more present, more accountable, more emotionally alive, more capable of loving from the heart instead of hiding behind the mask. That is the sacred hope of this journey. Not the hope that asks you to wait without boundaries. Not the hope that tells you to ignore reality. Not the hope that romanticizes avoidance. But the hope that truth, when it is finally faced, can change a man from the inside out. Because the divine masculine does not awaken by pretending to be strong. He awakens by discovering what real strength actually is. Real strength is telling the truth when silence would be easier. Real strength is taking responsibility when excuses would be safer. Real strength is feeling grief without becoming bitter. Real strength is holding tenderness without shame. Real strength is saying, I was afraid, but I do not want fear to be the ruler of my life anymore. That is the moment everything begins. Not the end of the journey. The beginning. The sacred beginning. The moment the soul rises through the cracks in the mask and says, You are not here to stay numb. You are not here to stay hidden. You are not here to keep running from love. You are here to become whole. And if he answers that call, his life begins to change. But if he does not, you must still keep walking toward your own light. Because you cannot live your life waiting for someone else to become honest with themselves. You cannot put your heart on hold while someone decides whether truth is worth the discomfort. You cannot sacrifice your peace to prove that your love was real. Your love was real because it came from your soul. Your worth is real whether he awakens today, tomorrow, or years from now. Your future is real even if he is still learning how to face his past. So bless his awakening. But do not lose yourself inside it. Let him meet the mirror. Let him face the grief. Let him hear the loud silence. Let him feel the old story collapse. Let him decide whether he will keep running from himself or finally become the man his soul is calling him to be. And you choose yourself. Not with anger. With grace. Not with bitterness. With clarity. Not because you do not care, but because you finally understand that your heart deserves a love that is not only felt in silence, but lived with courage. That is the final message. The exact moment the divine masculine starts awakening is not when he becomes fully healed. It is the moment he becomes honest enough to stop running from the truth inside himself. And the exact moment you start rising deeper into your own power may be the moment you stop waiting for his awakening to validate what your soul already knows. Truth is sacred. Love is sacred. But so are you. If this message spoke to your heart, write in the comments. The soul begins with truth. Like this video if it gave you clarity. Subscribe to the channel for more divine masculine, soul connection, twin flame, and emotional awakening insights. And share this message with someone who needs to remember that awakening does not begin with perfection. It begins with truth.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.